There is a particular kind of silence that falls across a harbour when the tide shifts in the deepest part of night. It is not the absence of sound, but rather a gathering of many small sounds into one continuous, almost imperceptible hum. You would hear it now if you were standing at the edge of the Kiel fjord on a November evening, perhaps sometime in the middle of the 20th century, when the world was still learning to breathe after the greatest upheaval it had ever known. The water laps against steel hulls with a rhythm that has no urgency, no impatience. It simply continues as water does, indifferent to the vast machinery that floats upon it, holding it, trusting it to stay afloat. There is fog rolling in from the Baltic. It moves slowly, deliberately, as if it has all the time in the world, and it does. The fog doesn't announce itself with drama or urgency. It simply appears, first as a vague thickening in the darkness, then as a presence that softens every edge, every outline, every certainty. The streetlights of the harbour district become diffuse orbs of amber and pale green. The cranes that tower above the shipyard floors, those enormous patient iron birds, fade into silhouette, then into shadow, then into something barely distinguishable from the mist itself. A ship's bell somewhere in the distance rings once, twice, muffled by the dampness in the air. It is a sound that has echoed across this same water for centuries, and it will echo for centuries to come. If you were to walk along the docks now, your footsteps would sound different than they do on clear nights. They would be softer, absorbed by the moisture hanging between the wooden planks and the stones. You might pass a dock worker making his rounds, his breath visible in the chill, a cigarette burning quietly near his lips. He would not look up. He has seen these nights before, countless times. There is a routine to harbour life that transcends any particular moment. The ships are there, silent in their berths. The water moves beneath them in slow, patient swells. The fog continues its unhurried arrival from the sea. Somewhere inland from the coast, if the fog permits you to see, there are streets lined with apartment buildings, some older, some newer, most bearing the marks of a history that was far more violent than this quiet night would suggest. There are homes where families are sleeping, where a child's doll sits on a shelf, where a photograph of someone in uniform hangs on a wall. Someone who may have departed from these very docks, may have boarded one of those dark shapes moving through the fog-laden water and never returned. But tonight, those homes are quiet. Tonight, all is still. The ships themselves, both the destroyers and the submarines, the cargo vessels and the tankers, they rest against their moorings, their hulls creaking slightly as the water shifts beneath them. That creaking sound is not one of distress. It is the conversation between metal and sea, between the work of human hands and the ancient forces of nature. The steel has been heated in great furnaces, beaten by rhythmic hammers, riveted together by the skillful hands of men who understood their craft with an intimacy we can scarcely imagine now. And now that steel floats, patient and dark, waiting for whatever comes next. Above all of this, the November sky is perfectly black. There are no stars visible tonight. The fog is too thick, the night too complete. There is only the water, the metal, the stone of the docks, and the soft, endless whisper of the sea meeting human construction, and somehow, improbably, both enduring. This is where our story begins. Not with the grand movements of history or the loud declarations of power, but with this, with fog rolling across a fjord, with water against steel, with the humble, patient infrastructure of two towns that would, over the course of more than a century, produce some of the most formidable naval vessels ever built. This is Kiel, this is Wilhelmshaven, and their story reaches back much further than this fog-laden night, back to times when the sea was less crowded, when the ambitions of empires were just beginning to crystallize, when these towns were still becoming what they would one day be. If you are interested in following this history, in learning how medieval trading ports transformed into the birthplaces of an entire underwater fleet, in understanding the ships and the people who built them, and in discovering how the fortunes of two harbors rose and fell with the tides of global conflict, then please do consider subscribing to this channel, where we explore the deep, often forgotten stories of places that shaped the world. Your subscription helps ensure that these narratives, these voices, continue to reach those who wish to listen as sleep approaches. For now, though, let us deepen into the world of these two German naval towns. Let us understand the geography that placed them precisely where history would find them most useful. Let us begin with the simple question of why Kiel and Wilhelmshaven existed at all before they became what they would become. The answer begins with a map, with coastlines and peninsulas, with the peculiar fortune of geography that sometimes places human settlements in the exact locations where the currents of history will eventually run strongest. The Jutland Peninsula, that vast protrusion of land that extends northward from the European mainland, creates a remarkable geography. On its western side lies the North Sea, that restless, stormy body of water that has challenged sailors for millennia. On its eastern side lies the Baltic Sea, a more sheltered, though no less important, inland sea. And between these two great waters, separated by the peninsula itself, lies a gap of merely 100 kilometers at its narrowest point. For centuries, this geographic reality meant something simple but profound. Any nation that wished to move a fleet or trade between the Baltic and the Atlantic, between the northern reaches of Europe and the wider ocean beyond, would have to find a way to do so. They could sail the long route around the northern tip of Scandinavia, or they could attempt to portage their vessels across land, or they could wait for human ingenuity to devise something better. Wilhelmshaven would eventually appear on the North Sea coast, a place name that literally means Harbour of Wilhelm, named for the king who dreamed it into being. Kiel, older by centuries, sits on the Kiel Fjord, an inlet of the Baltic that cuts deep into the Jutland Peninsula, providing a natural harbour of remarkable quality. Both towns owe their destinies, in many ways, to this simple geographic fact. They sit astride the bottleneck between two seas. And once a nation arose that possessed the naval ambitions to make that circumstance matter, these towns would become indispensable. But that time has not yet come, not in this fog-laden night, not in the quiet that currently prevails along their docks. For now, it is enough to simply be here, suspended in the darkness, listening to the water lap against steel, watching the fog roll in from the direction of the open sea, feeling the weight and patience of places that are not yet fully aware of the roles they will one day play. History moves slowly at first, so slowly that the people living through it often do not recognize what is occurring. An old trading port begins to take on a military character. An empty marshland begins to be reclaimed from the sea. The sounds of the shipyard begin to be heard more frequently, the hammers to strike more insistently, the whistles to call the workers back to their labor shift after shift, decade after decade. And yet, even in the midst of all that change, there will be nights like this, foggy, quiet, filled only with the essential sounds of water and harbor. These nights do not belong to history. They belong to the eternal conversation between human structures and the natural world. They belong to the workers heading home after their shifts, to the families sleeping in their beds, to the cats prowling the docks in search of rats, to the seabirds that will call out when the dawn comes. This is the backdrop against which everything else will unfold. This is the stage upon which empires will rise and fall, upon which men will dream great dreams and terrible ones, upon which nations will clash and thousands of souls will be lost to the depths. But for now, the fog continues to roll, indifferent and eternal, and the harbour rests. If you were standing on a map of northern Europe in the late afternoon, With the light beginning to soften over the Danish coastline, you would notice something that the sea itself has always known. There is a peninsula, Jutland, that extends downward from Denmark like a finger pointing toward the rest of the continent, and along its edges, sheltered by geography in ways that seem almost deliberate, two harbours came into being, not by accident, not by chance, but because of the way the coastlines fold, the way the winds blow, and the way the currents move through the narrows between two ancient seas. To understand why Kiel and Wilhelmshaven exist where they do, you must first imagine the waters around them. On one side of the Jutland Peninsula lies the North Sea, a broader, rougher expanse of water, open to the Atlantic, turbulent and restless, lined with treacherous shallows and the kind of unpredictable weather that has tested sailors for 1,000 years. On the other side, to the east, lies the Baltic Sea, calmer, more enclosed, a vast inland water that touches the shores of what would become Sweden, Russia, Poland, and the rest of the Eastern European coast. These two seas do not mix easily. They are separated by the Jutland Peninsula, and only through narrow straits, the Great Belt and the Little Belt, and eventually the Kattegat and Skagerrak, can a ship pass from one to the other. Now picture a peninsula itself as both barrier and bridge. Jutland juts down between these two very different bodies of water, and at its southern base, where Denmark narrows and where the peninsula approaches the German lands beyond, two remarkable fjords carved by Ice Age glaciers long ago had already written themselves into the landscape. The Kiel fjord reaches inland from the Baltic like a long, sheltered finger, and this deep, protected waterway, bordered by low, gentle hills and almost entirely closed off from the rougher seas beyond, offered something precious to any people who might wish to build a port. The fjord is deep enough for heavy ships. It is wide enough for maneuvering. It is protected from the worst storms, and from Kiel, a traveller might, in just a few hours' sailing, reach the open Baltic, or alternatively, with effort and careful passage through the narrower straits, reach the North Sea and the Atlantic beyond. Wilhelmshaven's geography is different, but no less deliberate in how it would shape history. Situated on the North Sea coast itself, on what was once the marshland and tidal flats of the Jade Bay, it faces directly outward toward the North Atlantic and the broader world. There is no fjord to cradle it. Instead, there is exposure. There is directness. A ship leaving Wilhelmshaven knows immediately that it has entered the open ocean. There are no sheltering hills. What exists instead is a wide, deep natural harbour, the Jade, where the tides sweep in and out with their ancient rhythm, and where, with the right kind of engineering, a nation could carve out basins and docks and build something formidable from what had been, not long before, only mud and grass and the occasional farmstead built on stilts. Why does geography pull history into being? It is a question that echoes beneath so much of what we know, and here, on the coasts of Jutland, the answer seems written in the very shape of the land. A ruler with ambitions for naval power would look at these two locations and see something irresistible. Kiel, already ancient as a trading town, already established on the Baltic, already connected by natural channels to the broader world. And Wilhelmshaven, empty and waiting, sitting on a North Sea coast where a port of sufficient strength and ambition could be constructed from nothing, and from which a fleet could sally forth to command the waters that separated the British Isles from the European continent. Between these two harbours, separated by perhaps 100 miles of Jutland's length, a connection would eventually be made. The Kiel Canal, though that comes later in this story, would someday link them directly, turning what had been separate strategic assets into a unified system, a naval circulatory system through which the life of an expanding German navy could flow. But first, each place had to come into being through its own quiet history. Each had to develop according to its particular geography, its particular opportunities, its particular constraints. The people who lived along these coasts understood their waters. They understood the tides. They understood where ships could go and where they could not. They understood that Kiel, with its ancient deep fjord and its connection to the Baltic, was a place where a medieval merchant class had long gathered to trade. And they understood, or would come to understand, that Wilhelmshaven, for all its barrenness and its exposure, could be transformed into a fortress harbour if only someone with sufficient will and sufficient resources decided to make it so. The marshes could be drained, the tidal basins could be dredged, docks could rise from empty ground, a naval city could be called into existence where previously there had been only the rhythm of tides and the calls of seabirds. This is how geography whispers to human ambition. It does not command, it does not demand, but it suggests. It opens certain doors and closes others. And the moment that those suggestions were heard, the moment that a growing German state began to imagine what kind of navy it might possess, and where that navy might make its home, these two quiet harbour towns, separated by the length of Jutland, separated by the nature of their waters and their exposures, would find themselves at the centre of an unfolding drama. If you wish to follow this maritime story in all its depth, from the first timber hulls launched on the Kiel fjord to the final U-boats that slipped beneath the waves from these same ports, we invite you to subscribe to this complete naval history. We will walk through the centuries to come, slowly, with all the detail and quiet reverence that such a story deserves. For now, though, know that geography has made its opening statement. The stage is set, the waters are waiting. And in the centuries that followed, two towns built into the landscape of Jutland's coasts would become something far larger than their founders might have imagined. They would become the birthplaces of empires at sea. They would become witnesses to ambition and to loss. They would become, in the end, the places where history was forged in steel and fire and water, where men laboured and dreamed and departed on journeys from which many would never return. The fjord and the harbour sit quiet now, in this moment before their transformation, but the waters remember everything. And the geography remains, patient and ancient, ready to hold whatever stories the years ahead would bring. To understand Kiel, one must travel backward through centuries of quiet accumulation, watching a modest Baltic trading post slowly realize what it was meant to become. The town did not spring into existence as a naval power. It arrived instead as a merchant's dream on the threshold of the Middle Ages, when the waters of the Kiel fjord first beckoned to men with ships and ledgers and the hope of profit from distant lands. In the 12th century, when the Hanseatic League was weaving its invisible nets across the Baltic and the North Sea, merchants began to recognize what geography had already understood, that Kiel's natural harbour offered shelter and depth, that its fjord opened like a hand receiving treasure. The waterway cuts inland from the Baltic, a glacially carved valley that the retreating ice age left behind some 10,000 years before, deep and navigable and protected from the worst of the northern storms. Early traders established themselves here, building wooden wharves and simple warehouses, their ships arriving laden with amber from the east, salt from the coastal mines, timber cut from forests that seemed to stretch without end. In return, they carried cloth and grain and the goods of a growing Christian commerce across waters that had once belonged only to Vikings. The town that grew around this harbour was never meant to be a major city, though it nurtured modest ambitions. Stone churches rose in the medieval style, their spires visible from ships approaching through the fog. Narrow streets wound between merchant houses, their gabled roofs bearing the weight of Baltic winters. The rhythm of the town became tied to the rhythms of the sea, the arrival of trading fleets, the departure of merchant vessels toward Lübeck or Copenhagen, or the distant ports of the Hanseatic network. Fishermen worked alongside traders. Rope makers and sail makers established their workshops near the harbour. Their skills passed from father to son across generations. This was Kiel, as it existed for centuries. A working town, modest in scale but conscious of its importance. A place where the sound of the water never stopped, where commerce and craft wove themselves into the daily textures of life. What is striking, when one pauses to imagine this medieval Kiel, is that it possessed no awareness of its future. The harbour was simply a harbour. The fjord was simply a fjord. Beautiful, yes. Useful, certainly, but not yet transformed by the great industries that would one day make it famous and terrible. The people who lived there in the 13th and 14th centuries could not have known that these same waters would one day cradle iron vessels of war, that the quiet fjord would resound with the noise of industrial construction, that their descendants would build machines designed to destroy other ships and the men who sailed them. History does not announce itself. It arrives in small increments, each generation inheriting the geography of their ancestors and gradually reshaping it to meet new purposes. The medieval period extended its tenure over Kiel for a long span of years. The town remained connected to the Hanseatic League's network of mutual benefit and shared trade rules, a system that valued peace and predictable commerce above the chaotic ambitions of individual princes. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, the political landscape was changing. The great duchies and kingdoms of northern Europe were consolidating power. The Hanseatic League itself, once so dominant, began its slow decline as nation-states grew stronger and trading cities found themselves subordinated to larger territorial interests. Kiel, too, found itself swept into this transformation. In the 15th and 16th centuries, it became part of Holstein, a duchy bound to the Danish crown through complicated dynastic arrangements. The town remained a harbour, but its independence diminished. The decisions that shaped its future were now made in distant halls by dukes and kings who thought in terms of territory and power rather than merchant profit. Yet even as its political status shifted, Kiel remained fundamentally itself, a place where the rhythm of the sea continued. Merchants still came and went. Fish were still caught from these waters. Ships were still built here, the craft passing into the hands of new generations of carpenters and shipwrights who knew the characteristics of wood, who understood the subtle arts of caulking and mast placement, who could read a fjord's currents and shape vessels accordingly. One might wonder whether any awareness existed among these craftsmen that they were, in some sense, preparing themselves for a future transformation. Did any shipwright, fitting planks to the frame of a merchant vessel, sense that the waters of his harbour would one day demand something different? Vessels built not for trade but for war, constructed not with wood but with steel, designed with purposes far beyond the peaceful movement of goods. The answer, of course, is no. These were practical men engaged in practical work. They knew their trade, and they practiced it well, but they lived in their own time. The future was not yet written into the very fabric of Kiel. It existed only as possibility, as the slow gathering of conditions that would eventually create the circumstances for change. The fjord was patient. It had waited 10,000 years since the glaciers retreated, and it would wait a few more centuries before its destiny began to reshape itself. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Kiel had become something like an established provincial town, respectable, functioning, connected to larger systems of commerce and politics, but not dominant within them. The Danish monarchs who ruled the region took only passing interest in Kiel's harbour, preferring instead to develop Copenhagen and other Danish ports. Holstein and Kiel existed in a kind of quietude, a period when history seemed to move slowly. But beneath this surface calm, the enormous forces of European modernity were gathering. Industrialization was beginning its slow creep northward from Britain. New philosophies of state power were emerging. The idea was growing that a nation's strength could be measured not merely in land or hereditary claims, but in naval capacity, in the ability to project power across the seas, to protect commerce, to deny rivals the use of strategic waterways. It was precisely these currents of thought and technological change that would eventually transform Kiel from a peaceful merchant town into something far grander and far more consequential. But that transformation was not yet visible on the horizon. For now, the town continued its long, quiet existence, its fishing boats and merchant vessels moving through the fjord, its people living out their lives in the way that people in small harbour towns have always lived, dependent on the water, shaped by the seasons, connected to the larger world through the thin silver thread of commerce. The Kiel fjord itself remained what it had always been, a natural masterpiece of geography, a deep waterway sheltered by the surrounding land, opening toward the Baltic and the wider world beyond. In daylight, it was a beautiful place, the water reflecting the sky, the shores rising gently toward forests and fields. In the fog, which came frequently and thick, it became something quieter still, a place where sound traveled strangely and distances became uncertain. Ships, moving through that fog, moved slowly, guided by the knowledge of their captains and the instincts of their crews. Generations of Baltic sailors knew these waters, knew the character of the fjord, knew where the depths were sufficient for large vessels and where the bottom rose up to catch the unwary. This knowledge, accumulated across centuries, would eventually prove invaluable, but in the 18th century, it served only the purposes of ordinary maritime life. No one was preparing for what was to come. History was simply proceeding, one day following another, one generation teaching the next, the fjord remaining constant, while the world around it slowly transformed. And that transformation, when it came, would arrive not from the east or south, but from the newest power rising in northern Europe, a Prussian kingdom that would see in Kiel's harbour exactly what it needed to fulfill its ambitions upon the sea. While Kiel had been sleeping its slow medieval dream on the Baltic, watching merchant ships come and go across centuries, something altogether different was stirring on the North Sea coast. In the 1850s and 1860s, Prussia, a kingdom with land but without a true ocean fortress, began to look westward toward those churning tidal flats where the Jade River met the grey waters of the North Sea. And there, in one of history's more peculiar acts of transformation, the Prussians would build an entirely new city from nothing but mud and ambition. The location itself seems almost absurd when you stand there now. Wilhelmshaven did not exist as a town. There were no foundations, no streets, no centuries of accumulated life. What existed instead was marshland, treacherous, flood-prone, home to wading birds and the restless push and pull of the tides. Twice daily, the North Sea would surge in through the Jade estuary, and twice daily it would retreat, leaving behind glistening mudflats that smelled of salt and ancient earth. For generations, this place had belonged to no one in particular. It was useful only to fishermen who knew its dangerous rhythms, and to those hardy enough to survive in small settlements clinging to the slightly higher ground. But geography, you must understand, had been gnawing at the minds of Prussian strategists for decades. The kingdom controlled vast territories inland, rich, powerful, militarily formidable, yet it had almost no natural harbour on the North Sea where a true ocean-going fleet could shelter and build. Bremen had its access to the sea, but it was hemmed in by other jurisdictions, complicated by old rights and ancient privileges. Hamburg likewise. If Prussia was ever to become a genuine naval power, to compete with Britain and France on the world's oceans, it needed something it could control completely, something it could shape according to its own vision, and that something would have to be built from scratch. In 1853, the Prussian government acquired the rights to the Jade estuary. The negotiation was delicate. There were local interests to consider, landowners to compensate, agreements with the Grand Duchy of Oldenburg to finalize. But once the decision was made, once the treaties were signed and the bureaucratic machinery set in motion, the transformation began with a quiet inevitability that reminds us how thoroughly 19th-century industrial power could remake the Earth itself. Imagine the scene as autumn came to the Jade in 1854 or 1855. Surveyors arrived first, walking across the tidal flats with their chains and instruments, measuring distances that would soon mean everything. Where would the harbour basin be dug? How deep would the water channel need to run? Where would the breakwaters rise to shield ships from North Sea storms? Behind them came the labourers, hundreds, then thousands of them, moving earth and stone, driving wooden pilings deep into the mud to create foundations where none had existed before. They built with barges and dredges, with manual labour and early steam-powered equipment. The sound of hammering would have been constant, echoing across the marshes like a slow, rhythmic pulse. What unfolds over these years is a kind of deliberate creation myth, though written in concrete and steel rather than in poetry. The harbour basin was excavated first, a massive undertaking that required the removal of hundreds of thousands of tons of earth and silt. Where did it go? Some was piled up to create the land upon which the town itself would stand, higher than the surrounding marshes, safer from flooding. Other material was used to reclaim additional land further out. Slowly, methodically, the tidal flats gave way to engineered landscape. Breakwaters of granite and stone rose to shelter the inner harbour. Channels were dredged to allow ships of increasing draft to enter and depart safely. Dry docks were constructed, massive facilities where vessels could be hauled out of the water and worked upon. But it is the human settlement that perhaps tells the deeper story. For a naval base to function, sailors needed places to live. Officers required quarters befitting their station. Workers and their families had to find housing within a reasonable distance of the yards and the ships. Schools were needed for children, markets for food, taverns and shops, and all the small infrastructure of ordinary life. Yet Wilhelmshaven, in these early decades, was not a town that grew organically over centuries. It was a town that was built according to plan. Streets were laid out in a rational grid. Housing blocks were designed with a particular vision of what a naval town should be. There is something both admirable and unsettling about this process. The creation of a whole community according to deliberate specifications, rather than the messy, beautiful chaos of a town that emerges from generations of individual human choices. Yet for those who lived there, in the 1860s and 1870s, it was home. It was where they raised children and buried their dead. It was where they experienced joy and hardship and the ordinary texture of human existence, even if the streets they walked on had been drawn by engineers rather than worn smooth by centuries of human feet. By the 1860s, Wilhelmshaven had become not merely a possibility, but a fact. The harbour was functional. Ships were being built or were being fitted out for service. The population had grown from nothing to several thousand. The docks were taking on that particular character they would maintain for the next 80 years. The sound of riveting hammers, the smell of fresh-turned timber and hot metal, the sight of cranes and scaffolding always under construction, always being improved and expanded. Workers lived in neat rows of housing behind the waterfront. Their wives shopped at markets that had been created from whole cloth a decade earlier. Children played on streets that hadn't existed in their parents' youth. This creation of Wilhelmshaven speaks to something essential about the 19th century. This period's almost supernatural faith in human engineering, in the capacity of will and capital and organized labor to reshape the natural world. The North Sea coast had existed here for millennia, unmolested and indifferent. The tidal flats had their own rhythms, their own ecology. And then, within a generation, All of it had been reconfigured to serve Prussian ambitions. Marshland became shipyard. Mud became streets. Emptiness became a naval fortress. Yet there is also something poignant in it. Those early workers and settlers, laboring to build Wilhelmshaven from nothing, did they sense that they were creating something that would ultimately bring them suffering? Did any of them, in quiet moments, wonder whether coaxing an entire city from the North Sea mud was truly a service to humanity? Or were they, quite simply and understandably, doing their work and earning their wages and making a life, without troubling themselves with such questions? The answer, almost certainly, is that it was both. They were builders and engineers and workers, many of them skilled and proud of their craft. They were also caught in historical currents far larger than any individual choice. Wilhelmshaven had been made, deliberately, to serve as a naval base. That was its purpose from the beginning. Within decades, that purpose would become increasingly militarized. But in these middle years of the 19th century, as the marshes slowly gave way to docks and the first warships began to arrive in the harbour, it may have still seemed possible that this could be simply a city like any other, a place where commerce and naval presence could coexist, where ordinary life could flourish. The map of Europe was being redrawn across the 1860s, and in those careful, deliberate strokes lay the seeds of everything that would transform Kiel and Wilhelmshaven from provincial towns into the beating heart of a new German naval power. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor whose name would define an era, understood something that the medieval traders and 19th century landowners of these harbour towns could scarcely have imagined. Geography, in the hands of ambition and steel, could become destiny. Before unification, before the German Empire itself existed as anything more than a collection of competing kingdoms and principalities, Prussia had already begun to think like a continental power. But there was a problem that kept strategists awake at night, a problem written in water and coastline. The Baltic Sea, where Kiel lay in its sheltered fjord, was cut off from the open ocean, from the North Sea and the Atlantic beyond, separated by the narrow passages between Denmark and Sweden, passages that could be choked or closed in an instant by a hostile power. Any German fleet built in the Baltic would be, in effect, imprisoned there, and Wilhelmshaven, on the North Sea coast, was isolated in the opposite direction, cut off from the rich trade routes and naval power centers of the Baltic and Russia beyond. This geographic frustration, this sense of being divided by water when water should connect you, was exactly the kind of problem that seized the imagination of German naval planners as the new empire took shape in 1871. What if you could connect them? What if a canal, a deliberate human-made passage carved through the landscape, could turn two isolated ports into one unified, doubled gateway? It was an idea that had been whispered about in planning offices for decades, but it was only after German unification that it became more than whisper, it became will. The very first years of the German Empire under Wilhelm I, with Bismarck orchestrating, saw a slow but unmistakable shift in how the nation thought about itself. Germany was no longer merely a land power, huddled in Central Europe, playing the old balance of power games with Austria and Russia and France. Germany was becoming an industrial titan, and titans, the thinking went, needed navies. They needed trade routes protected by steel. They needed global presence. They needed Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, these two towns that fate had placed on the threshold between two seas. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ascended to the throne in 1888, inherited his grandfather's empire, but brought something new to it, a consuming passion for naval power that bordered on the obsessive. He had been born in an age when Britain ruled the waves, when the Royal Navy was the unquestioned master of every ocean, and Wilhelm could not bear the thought that Germany should remain secondary, should remain landlocked in spirit, even if not in fact. He surrounded himself with admirals and engineers who shared his vision, men like Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who would become the architect of German naval ambition. And it was Tirpitz and Wilhelm together who seized upon the canal idea and transformed it from an engineer's dream into national policy. In 1887, even before Wilhelm became emperor, plans were being drawn in earnest. A canal would be built. It would cut through the Jutland Peninsula, from the Kiel Fjord in the south to the North Sea coast near Wilhelmshaven in the north, a distance of roughly 60 miles through lowlands and marsh and ancient soil. And when it was finished, when that ribbon of water was carved into being, the two towns would no longer be separated. They would become the jewel heart of German naval power, the northern gateway through which the high seas fleet could flow from one ocean to the other at will, free from any dependency on the straits controlled by others. One can imagine the conversations in the cafes of Kiel in those years, the slow awareness spreading through Wilhelmshaven's growing neighborhoods that something enormous was about to change. The canal would require workers, thousands of them. It would require investment, capital, confidence in the future. It would transform these towns not just economically but spiritually, turning them from places where ships happened to be built into places that existed, fundamentally, for the purpose of building ships and projecting power. The Kiel Canal, as it came to be called, began construction in 1887. For nearly a decade, the sound of excavation filled the landscape, as steam shovels bit into earth and workers labored in the marshes of Schleswig-Holstein. The scale was almost incomprehensible for the time. Millions of tons of material moved, lock systems designed and built, the entire hydrology of a region rearranged to human specification. It was completed in 1895, though it would be widened and deepened many times over in the coming decades, as ships grew larger and naval ambitions grew more urgent. When the first vessels passed through in 1895, it was not yet the gleaming monument to industrial power and national will that it would become. It was functional, utilitarian, a passage, but what it represented was already clear to anyone paying attention. The marriage of two port cities into one strategic entity, the binding together of Baltic and North Sea into a single operational theatre, the physical manifestation of German unity and German ambition in concrete and water. For Kiel, the canal meant something particular. Here was validation, confirmation that the ancient Baltic trading town's future lay not in commerce alone, but in military service. The fjord would become not just a harbour, but a naval base, and the canal would be its umbilical cord to the wider world. Engineers and architects descended upon the town, drawing plans for expanded shipyards, for workers' housing, for all the infrastructure that a modern naval power required. Wilhelmshaven, younger and less rooted in medieval history, transformed even more dramatically. The marshes that had been reclaimed with such effort just decades before were themselves now transformed again, this time into the infrastructure of empire. New shipyards rose, larger and more modern than anything that had existed before. The dry docks were expanded, the harbour was dredged deeper to accommodate ever larger vessels. The town that had barely existed 50 years earlier was becoming one of the greatest naval bases in Europe. Between these two towns, the connection was no longer merely geographic. It was now psychological, strategic, unified by shared purpose and shared identity. They were twin gateways, and through them would pass the warships and submarines that Germany would build in the decades to come, vessels that would carry German power to every ocean and ultimately toward a conflict that would dwarf even the grandest ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm and his admirals. What remained unspoken in the speeches and the planning documents was this: by binding these two towns so tightly to the fate of German naval power, by making their entire identity and economy dependent on the building and maintaining of warships, The unification process had created something fragile. When that power finally failed, as all power eventually does, the towns would find themselves adrift, stripped of their reason for being. But in the 1890s and the early years of the new century, such thoughts seemed distant, almost impossible. The future stretched before Kiel and Wilhelmshaven like the open water they could now reach through the canal. It seemed infinite with possibility. In those last decades before the 20th century arrived, something quiet and profound began to reshape the human landscape of both these towns. The rhythm of work changed. Where Kiel had once been a place of merchant ships and Baltic trade, and where Wilhelmshaven had only recently climbed up from marshland and tidal flats, there emerged now a different kind of heartbeat altogether, the steady, determined pulse of industrial shipbuilding at scale. Picture, if you will, the morning shift beginning. The light would come pale and soft across the North Sea coast, or filtered through Baltic mist, and from the workers' quarters that had begun to cluster around both harbours, thousands of men would move toward the yards with a kind of practiced rhythm that spoke of routine worn into muscle memory. Most were not trained specialists at first. They were farmers' sons, dock workers, men drawn from across Prussia and beyond by the promise of wages that, while modest, offered something steady, something that didn't depend on harvest or weather or the unpredictable vagaries of small-scale trade. The shipyards themselves were almost cathedral-like in their scale and purpose. High wooden frames rose above the waters, their silhouettes dominating the skyline. Within these vast open-air spaces, the work proceeded with a kind of orchestrated chaos that nonetheless followed precise patterns. The sound, this is what many accounts emphasize, the sound was almost overwhelming. Imagine thousands of rivets being hammered home simultaneously, each one requiring a man inside the hull to hold an anvil block steady, while another man outside struck with rhythmic, practiced force. Clang, clang, clang. The noise was so pervasive that workers developed a kind of language of hand signals, of looks and gestures, to communicate across the thunderous din. What would a conversation sound like when you had to shout to be heard 5 feet away? For many of these men, their work was conducted almost in silence, a communion of movement and muscle rather than words. The riveters themselves occupied a particular status in the yard hierarchy. To drive rivets properly, to angle the hammer correctly, to strike with precisely the right force, to repeat this motion hundreds of times a day, without developing a tremor in your wrist. This required not just strength, but a kind of artisanal skill. Older riveters would pass their knowledge to younger ones, not through formal instruction but through apprenticeship, through watching and working alongside until the rhythm became instinctive. Some men specialized in the particularly difficult work of riveting the curved plates that formed a ship's hull, where the angle changed constantly and the geometry demanded constant mental adjustment. These men were valued, respected, sometimes even celebrated. The best riveters could work so efficiently that entire plates would be sealed in a single shift, the rivets forming perfect lines that would hold against decades of sea pressure and storm. But the riveters were only one part of a much larger ecosystem of labor. Welders began to appear as technology evolved, men who worked with new electric equipment that was itself still experimental, still dangerous in ways not fully understood. Sheet metal workers shaped and cut the steel plates before they could be assembled. Platers laid out the hull sections according to designs transmitted through careful drawings. Caulkers sealed the seams between plates with lead and oakum, creating a watertight seal that was absolutely essential. Painters applied layer after layer of protective coating against salt and corrosion. Electricians began to wire the new ships, threading copper cables through compartments and below decks, in preparation for the electric motors that would power searchlights, winches, communication systems. And above all of this worked the engineers, the men with education, with technical knowledge, who studied the plans and made decisions about how a ship should be built, how it should be modified, how problems should be solved when the reality of construction disagreed with the theory of design. The hours were long. A typical shift might run 10, sometimes 12 hours, and this was work that demanded sustained attention and physical effort. Lunch might be eaten at your station, bread, cheese, perhaps some sausage, washed down with beer or weak coffee. Injuries were common. A slip with a hammer could break bones. The noise itself could eventually damage hearing, though this was not widely acknowledged or discussed. Men would fall from heights. Others would suffer severe burns from the heating processes. The yards had no real safety culture as we would understand it today. An accident meant you stopped working for a few weeks, or perhaps you simply returned too early because you needed the wages, because your family depended on them, because there was no safety net below. And yet, and this is what makes the historical record of these yards so psychologically complex, many men seem to have taken genuine pride in their work. There is something in the human spirit that responds to craftsmanship, to being part of something larger than oneself. When a ship was launched, the entire town would seem to gather. There would be speeches, perhaps a brass band, the breaking of champagne against the hull. Workers who had hammered rivets into that hull would watch it slide down the ways into the water, and something in that moment of transformation from steel and rivets and paint into an actual vessel capable of floating, of moving through the world, something in that moment seemed to validate the thousands of hours of difficult, dangerous labor. The towns themselves began to reorganize around these shipyards. Workers' housing sprawled outward from the yards in districts that became, over time, tightly knit communities. In Kiel, neighborhoods like Garden became almost entirely populated by shipyard families. The same was true of areas around Wilhelmshaven. These were not luxurious accommodations. Most were modest row houses, each one similar to its neighbor, with small gardens where families might grow vegetables or keep chickens. But they represented something new, a kind of working-class stability. For generations, German workers had been migrant, moving from place to place following work. Now, increasingly, there was work in one place, year after year, which meant you could settle, could rent or own a small house, could raise children knowing they would grow up in the same community. With these communities came a new kind of social structure. The shipyards created a working culture that had its own values, its own hierarchies, its own ways of understanding the world. A master riveter occupied a different social position than a general laborer, which occupied a different position than a skilled engineer. The unions began to organize, slowly at first, then with increasing sophistication. Workers' clubs formed, where men could gather after their shifts to talk politics, to drink beer, to read newspapers. Libraries began to appear in these neighborhoods, not because wealthy philanthropists were particularly interested in educating the poor, but because the workers themselves, often remarkably literate for the era, demanded them. There is something worth pausing on here, the intelligence and curiosity of these men. The shipyard workers of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven were not simple laborers. Many had received several years of formal education. German schools of the period were quite rigorous. They read newspapers, they discussed politics, they had opinions about labor conditions and rates of pay and the direction of their nation. They were, in many ways, the emerging modern working class, more educated and more politically aware than working people had been in previous eras. This would have profound consequences as the years progressed, but in these imperial years, in the 1880s and 1890s, these were simply the circumstances of their lives. They worked, they organized, they built ships, they raised families, they tried to improve their circumstances in small ways. The technical culture of the shipyards began to permeate the towns themselves. Young men from local families might apprentice in the yards, learning trades that could occupy them for a lifetime. Schools began to offer technical education in metalwork and engineering fundamentals. Maritime knowledge, which had always been present in these coastal towns, took on a new character. It became less about fishing or small-scale trade and more about the great machines of industrial navalism. Taverns would fill with talk of tonnage and armor plate thickness and the performance characteristics of various classes of ships. A boy growing up in Kiel or Wilhelmshaven in the 1890s would naturally absorb this language, this way of seeing the world through the lens of naval power. And hovering over all of this was the figure of the Kaiser and his vision for German naval dominance. The shipyard workers may not have cared deeply about the foreign policy ambitions of Wilhelm II, but they certainly cared about the contracts, the orders for new ships that would keep the yards operating, that would ensure employment and wages. The growth of the German Navy was, in very direct terms, an expansion of their own livelihoods. This created a kind of alignment of interest between the nationalist ambitions of the state and the simple economic needs of working people. Build more ships, and more men would have work. The Navy would expand, German power would grow, and the workers would eat. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to judge this alignment harshly, but it must be understood as lived experience, not as moral choice. By the turn of the century, both Kiel and Wilhelmshaven had been utterly transformed. They were no longer small towns, no longer peripheral places. They had become industrial centers, their entire existence organized around the construction of warships. The populations had surged, new schools had been built, new administrative buildings, new shopping districts to serve the growing workforce. The harbors that had once been quiet in winter, when shipping slowed, now thrummed with activity year-round. The rhythm of the seasons was no longer about harvests or fishing seasons, but about production schedules and launching dates, and the flow of raw materials and components. And in the evenings, as the light faded over the water and the men walked home from the yards, their clothes stained with oil and paint, their hands calloused and often marked by small cuts and burns, they carried with them the day's labor and the day's wages, and they passed through streets that had been entirely created to serve the needs of the ships that were building in those vast yards, for a navy that was itself being built into something unprecedented in German history. By the final decades of the 19th century, something profound had shifted in the consciousness of the German Empire. No longer content with land-based power alone, Kaiser Wilhelm II had begun to nurture an ambition that would reshape both Kiel and Wilhelmshaven forever. The dream of a navy that could rival Britain's supremacy on the world's oceans. And it was in Wilhelmshaven, that reclaimed marshland town on the North Sea coast, where this dream would take its most concrete and steel-bound form. The High Seas Fleet, as it came to be known, was not merely a military force. It was a statement of national identity, a gathering of iron and human will that would make Germany a global power in ways that land armies alone could never accomplish. And Wilhelmshaven, almost from its deliberate founding, seemed to have been designed for precisely this purpose. The harbour that had emerged from tidal flats and engineering ambition now became the primary home port of this growing fleet, the anchor point around which all other considerations revolved. Picture, if you will, the years between 1900 and 1914. The shipyards of Wilhelmshaven swelled with activity that seemed almost frantic in its intensity. Where once there had been marshland and silence, there was now the thunder of hammers, the shriek of metal being torn and shaped, the constant motion of cranes swinging massive hull sections into place. The Kaiserliche Werft, the imperial shipyard, became the beating heart of this transformation. New dry docks rose up, each one capable of cradling battleships of unprecedented size and power. The Dreadnought had been launched by the British in 1906, And this revolution in warship design sent a tremor through every naval power in Europe. Germany, under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz's careful strategic vision, would build its own dreadnoughts, and they would be built in Wilhelmshaven. The numbers alone speak to the scale of this undertaking. Between 1898 and 1914, Germany launched more battleships and battle cruisers than it had in the previous 50 years combined. The Friedrich der Grosse, the König, the Bayern. These were names that became synonymous with German industrial prowess and military might. But behind each name was a story of labor, of engineering brilliance, of thousands of workers pouring their skills into these floating fortresses. And yet, there was something else moving beneath the surface of all this activity. A tension, subtle but unmistakable, had begun to build. Kiel, too, had become a center of naval construction, and the rivalry between these two towns, though never openly acknowledged, gave the whole enterprise a restless energy. Where Wilhelmshaven was the high seas fleet's home, Kiel remained the traditional heart of German naval culture, the seat of the Naval Academy, the place where officers were trained and traditions were preserved. Each town fed the other's ambitions and fears. Which would prove more essential? Which would supply the greatest ships? The question hung in the salt-laden air like a promise or a threat. The workers themselves, who numbered in the tens of thousands by the first decade of the new century, lived within a culture that was increasingly defined by their work. Entire neighborhoods in both towns had been constructed to house them. Austere, orderly rows of workers' cottages, each one identical to its neighbors, each one a visible expression of the industrial machine that surrounded them. The shipyards operated on schedules that seemed almost impossible to meet. New keel-laying ceremonies became public spectacles, events that drew crowds and photographers and speeches about German greatness. The pace of work was relentless. Some men worked in the heat of the boiler shops, others in the drafty hull construction areas, still others in the cramped confines of the gun turret assembly shops. They were building something unprecedented, and there was a peculiar mixture of pride and exhaustion in their eyes. The officers of the growing fleet also formed a distinct class within these harbour communities. They were different from the workers who built their ships, moving through the towns in dress whites during the summer months, occupying officers' quarters that overlooked the harbour, their children attending separate schools. There was a formality to naval life that permeated everything. Even the civilian population found itself shaped by proximity to this military world. Young men from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, watching their fathers and uncles work in the yards, often enlisted in the navy themselves, creating family dynasties of service that would persist for generations. But beneath this atmosphere of pride and industrial accomplishment, there was another current, one that perhaps only those closest to the seats of power fully understood. The arms race that was driving this construction was also driving something else, a mounting tension between European powers that no one quite knew how to resolve. Germany was building its fleet specifically to challenge British naval dominance, and Britain, in turn, was building larger and faster ships in response. Each new German battleship launched from the waves was answered by a British counter-design. Each technological innovation was immediately copied and improved upon by rival navies. It was a competition that seemed to have no endpoint, no natural stopping point, and both Kiel and Wilhelmshaven existed now in the center of this competitive storm. In Wilhelmshaven particularly, one could sense this tension most acutely. The town had been built, quite literally, as a naval port. Its entire reason for existence was the fleet, and by 1910, with the expansion of the harbour facilities well underway, with new gun foundries and torpedo shops opening regularly, with the commissioning of new ships happening several times each year, the town had become almost entirely devoted to this single purpose. What would happen to Wilhelmshaven if the fleet were ever reduced. The question was unspoken, but it haunted the consciousness of the shipyard owners and the workers alike. They were all, in a sense, bound to this expanding machine. To question its necessity was to question their own livelihood, their own reason for existence in this isolated North Sea location. In Kiel, the tension manifested somewhat differently. As a city with older traditions, with a merchant marine heritage and a university, Kiel retained a broader identity. But even there, the naval presence was becoming increasingly dominant. The Kiel Canal, completed in 1895, had established the city as the crucial connection point between the Baltic and the North Sea, and traffic through the canal had grown steadily. Warships of the High Seas Fleet regularly transited through these waters, and the canal itself became a point of strategic obsession. If Germany's fleet was to be effective, it needed reliable passage between its two major naval bases, and that meant Kiel, and that meant the canal. What strikes one now, in retrospect, is the curious absence of real doubt during these years. There was worry about Britain, certainly. There was anxiety about maintaining competitive advantage in ship design and construction. But the fundamental assumption that this arms race was sustainable, that it served some rational strategic purpose, that it would not eventually lead to catastrophe, this assumption went largely unquestioned. The workers driving the rivets, the engineers designing the ship systems, the officers who would eventually command these vessels, the town leaders who welcomed the prosperity and pride that naval construction brought, they all seemed to operate within a kind of historical momentum that had its own terrible logic. The historian might ask, looking back across the century, whether any of them could have imagined what would come, whether any worker, standing in the din of a shipyard in Kiel or Wilhelmshaven in 1912 or 1913, might have possessed the prescience to see that the ships being built around them would, within just a handful of years, be sent to the bottom of the sea in a struggle of unprecedented violence. Probably not. They were building something that seemed to promise security and status. They were contributing to a national project that seemed to make sense within the logic of the time. And so the work continued. The High Seas Fleet grew. Wilhelmshaven expanded. Kiel's importance deepened. The two towns became, more and more, the beating heart of German power. The atmosphere was one of almost electric tension, a mixture of accomplishment and foreboding, of pride and anxiety, all held together by the daily work of construction, all supported by the belief that this could somehow, eventually, lead to safety and stability for the empire that had demanded it all. When the summer of 1914 arrived, the two towns had only begun to understand that the world they had carefully built over decades of peace was about to transform in ways they could not yet imagine. The High Seas Fleet, which had represented such pride and such enormous expense, was about to be tested in the way that every navy, in the back of its strategic mind, both dreaded and anticipated. And it would be tested not in the way that planners had expected, but in a way that would define the entire naval character of the coming war. The strain that gripped Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in those early months was unlike anything the towns had experienced. Young men who had trained in the shipyards, who had learned the rhythms of steel and steam, suddenly found themselves aboard those very vessels they had helped to build, steaming toward an uncertain horizon. The precision of naval routine, the morning bells, the careful maintenance schedules, the hierarchies of command, all of these things remained exactly as they had always been, and yet the entire weight of national survival seemed to press down upon every single man. Can you imagine the quiet that must have settled over the dockside when a battleship departed, knowing that weeks or months might pass before news would arrive about whether it had returned safely, or whether the names of its crew would appear in lists that everyone dreaded to read? The British blockade of the German coast began almost immediately, a suffocating economic embrace, that was designed to strangle the nation into submission. The North Sea became a graveyard before it became a battleground. Merchant ships that had once carried the commerce of nations were seized or sunk. The ports of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, which had always been gateways to the world's trade, became instead the isolated ends of a closed world. The supply lines that had fed the shipyards and the towns themselves began to fray. Food became rationed. Coal supplies, which were essential to keeping the naval engines alive, became precious and carefully hoarded. And yet within these two towns, a strange intensity took hold. The shipyards did not slow their work. If anything, they accelerated it. New vessels were being built at a pace that exceeded what had come before, driven by the desperate logic of a war at sea in which losses had to be replaced as quickly as possible. The men who worked the hammers and the welding torches, who shaped the plates of steel that would form the hulls of the next generation of warships, understood that their work was no longer simply craft or commerce. It had become survival. Some of these workers would themselves eventually leave the yards and join the navy. Others remained at their benches, understanding that to maintain the fleet was their duty, their way of fighting the war. But the question that haunted both towns was one that no amount of industrial effort could fully answer. Where was the high seas fleet? What was it doing? When would the great battle come that had been anticipated for so long? The moment in which German naval power would prove itself against the British Navy, the largest and most experienced in the world. The German High Command waited, the British Grand Fleet waited, and the towns waited with them, suspended in a kind of nervous anticipation that grew more acute with each passing month. Then, in late May of 1916, the moment arrived. At the latitude of a place called Jutland, off the coast of Denmark, the two great fleets found each other. The Battle of Jutland was the largest naval engagement in human history up to that point. A gathering of battleships and cruisers and destroyers that would have filled the entire horizon with smoke and fire, and the terrible sound of shells moving through the air at speeds that seemed impossible. In terms of the number of ships involved, in terms of the tonnage of steel that was gathered in that single place, it was unprecedented. And it lasted for 2 days, a chaotic, confusing, dramatic encounter in which visibility was poor, in which the weather turned foul, in which men aboard the vessels often could not see clearly what they were firing at, and in which the casualty lists grew longer and longer with each hour. Word of Jutland reached Kiel and Wilhelmshaven slowly. The initial reports were fragmentary, contradictory, filled with the fog that always surrounds any battle. But gradually, the truth became clear. The high seas fleet had not achieved the overwhelming victory that had been hoped for. The British Grand Fleet had not been destroyed. Instead, both sides had suffered significant losses, and both sides claimed victory, as armies and navies inevitably do. The German perspective was not entirely wrong. In tactical terms, the Germans had inflicted more damage on the British than they had sustained in return. But in the larger strategic sense, the outcome was less clear, and the German Navy, lacking the ability to inflict a final, crushing defeat, would never again attempt a decisive fleet action. The aftermath of Jutland settled over both towns like a slow fog that never quite lifted. The losses were real. The wounded came back to the hospitals. The letters arrived notifying families that their sons or their husbands would not be returning. The newspaper lists of the dead grew longer, and with all of this came a growing sense of stalemate, of exhaustion, of a war that had settled into a pattern from which there seemed to be no escape. The grand strategic ambitions that had animated the creation of the high seas fleet, the hope that German naval power could challenge British dominance and perhaps force a favourable peace, began to seem increasingly hollow. What remained was the blockade. The relentless, grinding blockade continued. Year after year, the British Navy maintained its stranglehold on German trade. The shipyards continued to build, but now with a sense of diminishing purpose. The workers continued to labor, but with a growing awareness that something fundamental had changed. The sailors who trained and waited in the harbors, and there were long periods of waiting, of routine exercises, of careful maintenance, of watching and waiting, they too began to sense that the war at sea had become something other than what they had anticipated. It had become a matter not of glorious naval battle, but of endurance. It had become about surviving the blockade, about the slow accumulation of hardship, about the gradual wearing down of resources and hope alike. In the shipyards of both towns, in the homes of the workers, in the barracks of the sailors, in the offices of the commanders, this awareness grew quietly, but inexorably. The First World War at sea was not going to be won, it seemed, in a single dramatic moment. It was going to be won or lost in the accumulated weight of months and years. And as the war ground on through 1916, 1917, and into 1918, that reality pressed down with an ever-increasing weight upon the two towns and upon every soul within them. By the autumn of 1918, something quiet had begun to shift beneath the surface of the German fleet. Not in any dramatic or announced way. There were no manifestos pinned to the walls of the officers' quarters, no secret meetings held in the cramped berths below decks. Instead, it was a change that moved through the ships like a slow current, invisible at first, then undeniable. The men who served in these vessels, many of them conscripted farmers and factory workers from inland towns far from any coast they had ever seen, had spent 4 long years in a state of waiting. They waited through the blockade, through the shortages, through the endless tension of sitting in harbour while their younger brothers died in the trenches. And as 1918 turned toward its final months, that waiting had curdled into something else entirely. The larger context should settle gently into your understanding. Germany was collapsing. The army on the Western Front was retreating in disorder. The American entry into the war in 1917 had shifted the mathematical certainty of outcome, and by September and October of 1918, even the military leadership could see what the politicians had begun to whisper: the war was lost. But the Kaiser and his admirals, rather than seek an armistice, had other ideas. They wanted one final grand naval engagement. They wanted to sortie the entire high seas fleet out into the North Sea, to meet the British Grand Fleet in a climactic battle that might restore honour, might rally the nation, might somehow change the arc of history through the sheer force of courage and steel. It was, in the context of imminent defeat, an extraordinary act of will divorced from any rational military purpose. On October 30th, 1918, orders came down to the ships. The High Seas Fleet was to prepare for what was called the final fleet action. The men in the engine rooms and gun turrets and signal stations of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven received these commands with a peculiar clarity. They understood what was being asked of them. This was not a maneuver designed to achieve anything but the honor of fighting. This was a gesture. And among the sailors who had endured the blockade, who had known hunger, who understood that armistice negotiations were underway in France and that the war was already over in every meaningful sense, the order to sail out to die struck something deep and dark and resistant in their souls. The mutiny, when it began, was not theatrical. There were no roaring crowds, no dramatic confrontations on the deck with officers. Instead, it was the simple refusal of men to obey. On October 29th, some sources say it began at Wilhelmshaven. Others point to a smaller incident days before. But by October 30th and 31st, as the ships were meant to weigh anchor and prepare for departure, the sailors simply sat. They remained at their posts but made clear, through silence and stillness, that they would not participate in this final action. It was not eloquently stated. It was not accompanied by speeches or revolutionary rhetoric. It was, in its own way, far more powerful because of its ordinariness. the mutiny spread from ship to ship with remarkable speed. The SMS Thüringen, the SMS Helgoland, the SMs König, these great battleships that had been built in the yards of these very towns, that represented the pride of German naval engineering, saw their crews gathering in small groups, talking quietly, making the decision that some things were beyond the honor of obedience. Officers attempted to maintain discipline. There were courts-martial threatened. Some men were arrested, but the refusal seemed to deepen rather than diminish. What had begun as a mutiny in the fleet quickly became something larger. Word reached the sailors' councils. These were early forms of worker and soldier organization that had been taking shape through 1918, and the movement spread into the streets of Kiel itself. By early November, Kiel had transformed into something neither wholly rebellious nor wholly controlled. There were demonstrations, but they were often peaceful. There were red flags raised on buildings, symbols of socialist and revolutionary sentiment that had been building pressure beneath the surface of German life for decades. The sailors and workers began to demand an end to the war, a resignation of the Kaiser, and a fundamental transformation of German political life. And here, in this Jutland town, where 1,000 ships had been built, where generations of riveters and engineers had poured their labor, the class tensions and political grievances that had accumulated through 4 years of war suddenly found an outlet. What should be understood, and what history sometimes obscures, is that the Kiel Mutiny was not the cause of Germany's collapse. The war was already lost. The generals knew it. The politicians knew it. But the mutiny, spreading from Kiel through other ports and garrison towns with remarkable speed, crystallized something. It made visible the fact that the army and navy would no longer fight. It transformed an abstract military defeat into a political reality that could not be negotiated away or reframed through propaganda. Within days of the mutiny's spread, workers' councils were forming in Berlin and other major cities. The Kaiser, understanding at last that his position was untenable, fled into exile. An armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. The First World War came to an end. Yet the sailors and workers of Kiel did not know, in those first days of November when they were raising red flags and holding meetings in the streets, that their quiet refusal would help reshape history. They were acting on immediate grievances, immediate exhaustion, immediate clarity about what was and was not worth dying for. They were saying, through their stillness and their simple refusal, that they had given enough, that empires and honor and the will of emperors were abstractions, and they were concrete and tired and human. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of this moment. In a town where metal had been shaped into weapons of war, where the ingenuity of engineers had been bent toward destruction, the decisive blow against the old order came not from advanced weaponry or tactical brilliance, but from ordinary people saying no. The high seas fleet never sailed. The final battle never occurred. The Kaiser abdicated, and Kiel, which had been central to Germany's rise as a naval power, became the place where that rise was quietly interrupted, not by enemies from without, but by subjects from within, who understood, with a clarity that transcended politics or ideology, that some prices were too high to pay. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a nation learning to breathe within constraints, so severe that every inhale felt rationed, every gesture measured and weighed against articles written in a hall in Versailles that none of the German people had entered, none of the sailors had seen. The treaty, signed in June of 1919, fell upon Kiel and Wilhelmshaven like a winter fog that would not lift for nearly 2 decades. And yet, within that fog, something curious happened. The yards did not die. They transformed. The terms were unforgiving, designed partly from pain, partly from fear of German naval power returning. Germany was permitted a navy. But what a navy it would be. No capital ships over 10,000 tons, no submarines, none. The very vessels that had prowled the Atlantic, that had terrorized merchant convoys and shaped the imagination of an entire nation, were declared illegal. Existing U-boats were to be surrendered, scuttled, or destroyed. Over 250 of them, many of them barely used, found their way to the bottom of harbors, or were dismantled piece by piece in the very yards where they had been born. And if you had stood in those harbors in 1919 or 1920, watching the systematic destruction of vessels that represented not just military power, but years of human ingenuity and labor, you might have wondered if these towns would ever build anything of consequence again. But shipyard workers are pragmatic creatures, and shipyard towns develop a particular kind of stubborn resilience. In Kiel, the massive yards that had constructed battle cruisers and dreadnoughts began to pivot, almost imperceptibly at first. Merchant vessels, cargo ships. The grind of warship production, the roar, the heat, the sense of building instruments of national power, gave way to something quieter and, in its own way, just as necessary. The yards employed thousands. Families depended on wages. Communities had built themselves around the rhythm of industrial labor. You cannot simply stop an entire city from functioning because a treaty forbids you from building battleships. The years between 1920 and 1933 in these two harbor towns exist in historical memory almost as an interregnum, a pause in a longer narrative. But for the people living through it, it was simply their lives. Children were born. Workers clocked in at dawn. Unions negotiated wages. There were strikes, economic hardships, particularly savage inflation in the early 1920s that made currency nearly worthless, that forced families into desperate improvisation. And yet the yards persisted. They adapted. Kiel developed a reputation for civilian shipbuilding of exceptional quality. The covered building halls, those vast structures with soaring steel frames, began to host the keels of merchant ships that would carry German goods across every ocean. There was no glory in this, no sense of national destiny, but there was work, there was continuity, there was, perhaps, a kind of quiet preservation of skill and knowledge. The engineers who had designed submarines understood hydrodynamics, understood steel under pressure, understood the thousand small problems that arise when you ask metal to hold its shape while water tries to crush it. Those insights do not disappear simply because treaties forbid their application to military vessels. They flow instead into designs for faster cargo ships, more efficient fishing vessels, more seaworthy merchant cruisers. Wilhelmshaven, too, adapted, though perhaps more painfully. It had been built as a military port, conceived from its very beginning as a fortress and a fleet base. Its identity was wrapped up in military purpose in ways that Kiel's was not. Kiel had been a trading city first, a naval city second, but Wilhelmshaven had no other reason to exist. Yet even Wilhelmshaven began to develop commercial function. Repair facilities were maintained. Ships from other nations came into the harbors for maintenance and overhaul. The vast dry docks, built to service battleships and cruisers, found new work. And in this adaptation, there was something almost subversive, though no one would have called it that at the time. These yards were keeping themselves alive, keeping their workers employed, keeping alive the muscle memory of industrial production, even as the law forbade the objects they most naturally knew how to build. The treaty itself, with a kind of bitter irony, contained within it the seeds of its own undoing. Germany was permitted to build a defensive navy. The specifications were limited, crushing in their constraints, but they left a narrow door open. And within that door, clever men began to work. Naval designers, constrained from building large warships, began to conceptualize smaller ones. Cruisers of the maximum permitted tonnage, designed with extraordinary efficiency and firepower, to overcome their size limitations. Torpedo boats. Minesweepers. What might have seemed, to an outside observer in those quiet yards during the 1920s, like routine peacetime naval maintenance was, in truth, a slow and careful intellectual preparation for something that the treaty's architects had not quite managed to prevent. In the shipyard archives of both cities, if you were to look through the records of those years, you would find something interesting. The continuation of experimentation, the quiet pursuit of knowledge. Metallurgists developed new alloys. Engineers refined hull designs for greater underwater stability. There was an almost academic quality to it, as if the yards were conducting research for a future that they could not yet see, but which they somehow sensed was approaching. Was this violation of the treaty's spirit? That is perhaps too grand a term. It was more like memory work. It was like a musician, forbidden from playing, practicing scales in silence, so that when permission came, or when permission was seized, the hands would remember. The rhythm of these towns changed during the interwar years. The frantic pace of warship construction during the imperial era and the war gave way to something steadier, more sustainable, less glamorous. The sense of national purpose that had animated the shipyards in 1914 or 1916 was replaced by simple economic necessity. Fathers came home with wages earned, not from building the instruments of empire, but from building vessels that would carry butter and grain and timber across the oceans of the world. It was, in a way, a return to something older, to the merchant tradition that Kiel had known centuries before it became a naval power. Yet there was, beneath this surface calm, a kind of waiting. The towns themselves seemed to wait. Kiel looked toward the Baltic, Wilhelmshaven toward the North Sea. The harbours were quiet in ways they had not been during the war, yet not entirely peaceful. There was a sense of latency, of potential energy held in check. And perhaps that is what interwar years often feel like to those living through them, neither one thing nor the other, suspended between what was and what might be, neither at rest nor in motion, but in a kind of frozen momentum, where the future has not quite begun, but the past is never truly past. The 1930s arrived in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven like a slow tide turning, imperceptible at first, then gathering force with each passing month. Where the Treaty of Versailles had once constrained German naval ambition to a handful of aging battleships and light cruisers, a new government began to quietly imagine a different future. And in the shipyards that lined both harbours, engineers and draftsmen who had spent a decade sketching designs that would never be built, suddenly found themselves dusting off old blueprints, adding notes in the margins, whispering calculations that might finally become steel. The Kriegsmarine, as it came to be called, did not emerge fully formed in 1933. Rather, it coalesced gradually from the old Reichsmarine, transforming itself through rearmament treaties, secret negotiations, and the careful interpretation of international law that permitted more than most nations realized. And as the pace of building quickened, a curious shift took root in both towns. The battleship, that symbol of imperial naval glory, would no longer be the centerpiece of German naval strategy. Instead, attention turned to a vessel that was faster to build, cheaper to produce, and possessed of an almost romantic appeal among the younger generation of sailors and engineers. The submarine, or U-boot as it was called in German, had proven devastatingly effective in the First World War. That was no secret. The world still remembered the terror of the unrestricted submarine campaigns, the merchant convoys sent to the bottom, the way a single boat could paralyze shipping lanes and bring a nation to its knees through hunger and industrial collapse. By the 1930s, this memory lingered in every naval planning office from London to Washington. And in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, designers began to reason thus. If the British maintained dominance in battleships and cruisers, If the German Navy could never hope to match the Royal Navy in a surface engagement, then perhaps the underwater realm offered a path to power that bypassed surface strength entirely. Perhaps, in the depths, a smaller nation with clever engineering and audacious tactics might find asymmetric advantage. The shift began subtly. In Kiel, the Friedrich Krupp shipyard and the Germania Werft, those two great yards that had built surface ships for generations, began to receive new commissions. The orders came marked with classifications. They were coded at first, even within the yards themselves. Workers noticed that certain sections were sealed off, that drawings were handled differently, that security personnel appeared where once there had been none. And then, gradually, the nature of the work became clear. They were building U-boats, not one or two as experimental designs, but dozens. The keels were laid in 1933, 1934, 1935, one after another, a steady rhythm of steel being shaped into the characteristic form of a submarine. The covered building halls of Kiel became the natural home for this work. These vast industrial cathedrals, roofed over to protect the work from weather and prying eyes, had been constructed in the previous era. Now they took on new purpose. Inside, riveted steel took shape in near darkness, lit by electric work lamps that cast sharp shadows across bare metal. The smell of oil and hot metal, of acetylene torches and grinding wheels, filled the air, and the sound, the constant metallic ringing of mallets on chisels, the whine of electrical drills, the occasional crack of a pneumatic wrench, created a sensory environment so complete, so all-consuming, that workers often emerged from a shift feeling as though they had been underwater themselves, in a world of pressure and confined space and mechanical necessity. Wilhelmshaven, too, expanded its submarine building capacity. Where that port had once been dominated by the massive dry docks that held the high seas fleet, engineers now surveyed the northern shore, looking for space where new slipways could be constructed. The marshland that had been drained and reclaimed a century earlier for the original naval base now served a new purpose. New covered building halls were erected, new machine shops, new assembly areas. The town seemed to vibrate with industrial purpose, and young men arrived from across Germany seeking work in the yards, drawn by steady wages and the sense of participating in something momentous. By the middle of the 1930s, the first of these new U-boats were taking to the water for trials. They were, by the standards of submarine engineering at the time, remarkably modern designs. The Type 7 was perhaps the most famous, a boat of approximately 700 tons displacement, capable of diving to significant depths, equipped with the latest diesel engines and electric motors, bristling with torpedoes in both bow and stern tubes. Compared to the submarines of the First World War, these vessels represented a leap forward in reliability, comfort, and capability. They were faster underwater than their predecessors. Their hulls could withstand greater pressures. Their torpedo systems were more sophisticated. And perhaps most importantly, they could be built quickly. A single U-boat of this type could be laid down, constructed, and launched in a matter of months, not years. The men who were selected to command these boats began their training in the early to mid-1930s. They were young, typically in their 30s or younger, hand-picked for their technical proficiency and their ideological alignment. Some were veterans of the First World War, men who had served on submarines and remembered the old methods. But many were newcomers to the submarine service, recruits who had never known anything other than the streamlined, efficient procedures of the modern Kriegsmarine. They studied in classrooms, learned to operate breathing apparatus in simulated emergency scenarios, familiarized themselves with the intricate machinery that would be their domain. And as they trained, the boats continued to emerge from the covered halls of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, their grey hulls taking on the distinctive lines that would become instantly recognizable. Here, perhaps, is a question worth lingering over. as the evening deepens. What did the workers in these yards think as they shaped steel into submarines? What conversations did they have during lunch breaks, sitting in the yard's canteens with their bread and sausage, watching the hulls take shape around them? Some, certainly, felt pride in technical achievement. The submarine was an engineering marvel, a triumph of careful design and precision manufacturing. Others may have harbored doubts about the direction in which their nation was moving, but the vast majority, in all likelihood, simply worked. They did their jobs, earned their wages, participated in the everyday rhythms of industrial life. History, in its grand movements, is often invisible to those living through it, visible only years later when seen in retrospect. What is clear is that by the end of the 1930s, Kiel and Wilhelmshaven had been fundamentally remade. They were no longer primarily towns that happened to have naval bases. They were naval bases that had become entire towns. Their economies, their social structures, their sense of collective identity, all bound up with the production of military vessels. The quiet fjord, that had once echoed only with the sounds of merchant shipping, now rang with the sounds of submarine production, and in the covered halls under the arc lights, the keels of boats continued to be laid, slowly, steadily, one after another, as though the sea itself were calling for them, as though the future were already written, waiting in the cold water below. Before those U-boats could slip beneath the surface and disappear into the grey-green darkness of the Atlantic, they had to be born in the shipyards of Kiel, and to understand their construction is to understand something rather remarkable about how human ingenuity can solve a problem so fundamental that it seems almost impossible. The problem of keeping a vessel that is meant to sink from sinking when you wish it not to. The submarine, you see, must do something no surface ship can ever do. It must be heavy enough to descend, yet buoyant enough to rise again. It must hold the sea at bay from all sides, not merely from beneath. This contradiction, the need to be simultaneously sinkable and survivable, drove every major design decision that the engineers in Kiel's covered halls would make when sketching out a new U-boat for construction. At the heart of every submarine lies what they called the pressure hull, and this is perhaps the most elegant and terrible solution to an impossible geometry. Imagine a cylinder of steel, thick-walled, impeccably welded, designed to resist not the crush of its own weight, but the crushing pressure of the ocean itself. Water presses down at a rate of approximately 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth, and a U-boat of the Kriegsmarine could descend to depths where the pressure would be equivalent to the weight of an entire city stacked upon a single point. The pressure hull needed to be strong enough to withstand this, yet as narrow and efficient as possible, because every kilogram of steel devoted to the hull is a kilogram not devoted to weapons, fuel, or living space for the crew. The craftsmen in Kiel would have watched as these cylindrical sections were rolled from massive steel plates, the metal heated until it glowed like dark amber, then bent around enormous drums. The seams where sections would be joined were scored with meticulous precision. Welders would spend hours fusing one cylinder to another, their torches hissing in the semi-darkness of the covered building halls, the sparks falling like slow fireflies. Every weld had to be perfect. A flaw in a single seam, a hairline crack that might seem insignificant on the surface, could spell the difference between a vessel that served her crew faithfully and one that imploded at depth with all souls lost. Around this central pressure hull, however, there existed another skin, a lighter, outer hull that gave the submarine her hydrodynamic shape. This outer hull was not meant to be watertight. Instead, it enveloped the pressure hull in a protective embrace, creating a space between them. And it was in these spaces, in the voids and chambers between the two hulls, that the submarine found her greatest secret, the ballast tanks. The ballast tank system, is the mechanism by which a submarine transitions from surface vessel to underwater explorer, and it works on a principle so simple that it seems almost quaint once you understand it. The tanks are empty chambers that can be either flooded or vented. When a U-boat sits upon the surface, her main ballast tanks are full of air, providing buoyancy. Her crew stands on deck in the fading light, perhaps feeling the salt breeze on their faces, and they are not yet ghosts. But when the order comes to dive, water begins to flow into those ballast tanks through ports that the submarine operators can open at will. As the tanks flood, the U-boat becomes heavier. Her bow tips downward. The deck beneath the crew's feet, if any remain topside, begins to angle toward the depths. Within moments, the conning tower slides beneath the surface, and the submarine becomes weightless, neutrally buoyant, hovering in the water column like some strange mechanical fish. The engineers in Kiel would have designed these ballast tanks with extraordinary care. There were main ballast tanks, certainly, but also trim tanks, smaller chambers devoted to minute adjustments of the submarine's pitch and roll. There were quick diving tanks, designed to allow the U-boat to submerge as rapidly as possible in emergency. The complexity of this system meant that a submarine carried not merely a handful of conscripted sailors, but also skilled petty officers trained to manage the delicate balance of water and air, the orchestration of flooding and venting that kept the vessel at the precise depth her captain desired. And then there are the torpedo tubes themselves, the tubes through which a U-boat would fire the weapons that made her lethal. Picture the interior of a submarine, cramped, narrow, every inch accounted for. The torpedoes, sleek and deadly, had to be housed somewhere. They were stored both in the tubes themselves and in external racks, their pointed noses reaching toward the bow and stern of the vessel. The design of these tubes was a study in miniaturized engineering. Each tube needed to be sealed from the interior of the submarine by a watertight door, a mechanism for flooding the tube, allowing seawater to rush in and equalize the pressure between the interior and the ocean beyond, had to function flawlessly. And then the tube needed to expel the torpedo with enough force to send it away from the submarine at sufficient speed that it would not immediately sink, but instead would begin its long run toward a distant target, sometimes kilometers away. The reloading mechanism for these tubes was another feat of design that visitors to the Kiel shipyards might have observed with a mixture of fascination and unease. A torpedo is not a small thing. It weighs nearly 2 tons. It must be maneuvered through the narrow corridors of the submarine, hoisted into position, guided into the tube with absolute precision. During peacetime construction, workers would practice this ballet dozens of times, perfecting the choreography of moving a weapon through a space barely wider than a man's shoulders. What emerges from contemplating these systems, the pressure hull, the ballast tanks, the torpedo tubes, is a recognition that a U-boat was less a vessel than a machine designed to solve a series of interlocking problems. Each solution created new constraints. The need for a strong pressure hull made the submarine heavier. The heaviness demanded a sophisticated ballast system. The ballast system required trained operators and added complexity to every dive. The submarine became, in essence, a collaborative invention between engineer and sailor, between the theoretical calculations made in Kiel's design offices and the practical realities faced by men living and working in a space no larger than a railroad car. And yet, despite all this complexity, despite the elegance of the design and the precision of the construction, the submarine remained fundamentally vulnerable. A single leak in the wrong place, a malfunction in the ballast system at a critical moment, a depth charge detonated nearby that cracked the pressure hull. Any of these could transform this marvel of engineering into a tomb, a steel coffin sinking into blackness. The men who built these vessels in Kiel understood this, perhaps better than anyone. They held the knowledge of their vessels' vulnerabilities in their hands as they welded and assembled and tested. They knew that somewhere across the sea, their creations would face enemies determined to destroy them. And yet they continued building, day after day, adding another U-boat to the growing fleet, another vessel that would soon slip beneath the waves and never return. The decade that followed the Versailles constraints proved to be, in many ways, a long and patient exhale. The German Republic had endured its years of humiliation and economic ruin, and by the early 1930s, a new energy began to move through the shipyards of both Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. It was not sudden, this energy. It arrived gradually, almost like the tide returning to the harbour after years of being held back. And nowhere was this returning tide more visible than in Wilhelmshaven, that artificial town carved from North Sea marshland barely 70 years before, which now began to transform itself once again, this time on a scale that would dwarf everything that had come before. You might pause for a moment and wonder what drives a harbour town to remake itself. For Wilhelmshaven, the answer lay in the decree and the vision of those who believed Germany's future lay not in compliance with the treaties that had constrained it, but in the deliberate, methodical reclamation of naval power. The shipyard that had built its identity through careful, limited construction suddenly found itself the subject of enormous ambition. Money flowed in. Workers arrived from across the Reich, drawn by wages and the promise of employment in a cause they were told was national resurrection. The physical transformation began almost invisibly, with excavation and the deepening of channels. But soon the evidence became impossible to ignore. New dry docks rose from the earth, their walls of reinforced concrete climbing skyward like fortifications. These were not the modest building facilities that had served the interwar years. These were structures designed to accommodate vessels of unprecedented size, docks capable of cradling battle cruisers and capital ships that would challenge the naval order of the entire Atlantic. To stand in Wilhelmshaven during these years, you would have witnessed a harbour town becoming something more than it had ever been, and perhaps more than it could sustain. The expansion extended beyond the docks themselves. Bunkers began to appear, massive underground facilities designed to protect the vessels, the supplies, and the men who would maintain them. These were not hastily constructed shelters, but rather elaborate networks of reinforced chambers dug deep beneath the harbour district, their walls thick enough to withstand any assault that might come from above. Workers laboured in shifts around the clock, deepening tunnels, installing drainage systems, creating spaces that felt less like harbour infrastructure and more like the chambers of a fortress. The harbour itself was becoming armed, becoming fortified, becoming something prepared for a war that planners believed was inevitable. Across the water in Kiel, a different kind of expansion was taking place, one less visible, but perhaps more profound in its implications. The ancient shipyard on the Baltic, which had evolved from medieval merchant halls into the birthplace of the high seas fleet, now became the centre of a new kind of production. The covered building halls that had been constructed in the imperial era were expanded and modernized. New facilities emerged, designed specifically for the construction of vessels that could operate underwater, vessels that had proven their worth in the previous war and would, planners believed, prove their worth again. The submarine, or U-boot as it was called in German, became the focus of Kiel's energy. The long, sleek forms of these boats began to take shape in the building halls, their pressure hulls carefully curved and welded, their torpedo tubes tested and refined. It is worth pausing here to consider what was happening beneath the surface of all this construction and expansion. Both towns were being deliberately prepared for a conflict that had not yet been declared, by a government that claimed it wanted peace, while simultaneously transforming its ports into instruments of potential war. There was something deeply contradictory about it. something that even the workers and engineers involved might have sensed, though perhaps not fully acknowledged. The prosperity was real enough. The employment was genuine. The sense of purpose and national importance was palpable in the air. And yet there was also something else, something quieter and more troubling, like a sound you can hear only if you listen very carefully, a warning beneath all the noise of construction and ambition. The shadow of what was to come began to settle over both harbour towns, not all at once, but in layers, like fog rolling in from the sea and gradually obscuring the landscape. The training facilities expanded. New barracks were constructed to house the sailors and officers who would crew the expanding fleet. Naval academies received greater resources. The culture of the towns shifted subtly but unmistakably. Where once Kiel and Wilhelmshaven had been industrial ports with a naval character, they now became almost military cities that happened to contain harbours. Children grew up in this atmosphere. Teachers incorporated naval themes into their lessons. The shops displayed uniforms and insignia. The local newspapers reported endlessly on the achievements of the fleet and the great vessels being launched. In Wilhelmshaven particularly, the sense of purpose was almost overwhelming. This town, which had been built from nothing by Prussian will and engineering skill, seemed to understand itself as a tool of national destiny. The harbour itself grew, its channels dredged deeper, its capacity expanded, supply depots were constructed, ammunition magazines were built, some of them underground, protected by layers of concrete and earth. The oil storage facilities emerged, massive tanks painted in dull colours, designed to fuel a fleet that would soon be called upon to contest the mastery of the seas. The town's population swelled as workers arrived seeking employment in the shipyards and the expanding military infrastructure. Housing development accelerated. Schools were built. The entire urban fabric was being rewritten by the requirements of naval preparation. What must it have felt like to live in these towns during these years? The physical reality was one of progress and employment, of opportunity and national pride. The streets were busy. Construction cranes swung overhead like patient giants. The sound of rivets echoing from the shipyards became as constant as birdsong, the background music of daily life. Workers went to their jobs with a sense that they were part of something significant, something that mattered on a national scale. The local economy flourished. People who had endured years of uncertainty and hardship after the First World War finally felt that things were improving, that their towns had purpose, that the future was being built in the present through their labour and skill. And yet, even in the midst of this expansion and apparent prosperity, there must have been voices, quiet ones perhaps, that whispered of concern, the rapidity of the armament, the secrecy that surrounded some of the new construction, the way that military priorities increasingly dominated the life of the harbour towns. The gradual normalization of uniformed personnel in streets that had been civilian spaces. The way that dissent, when it appeared, was met with increasing firmness by authorities who had little patience for anything that might impede the grand project of naval rearmament. The expansion of Wilhelmshaven and the transformation of Kiel under Nazi naval policy represented something almost unprecedented in modern history. The wholesale redesign of civilian harbour towns into instruments of potential military aggression, undertaken openly, with the participation and often enthusiastic support of the local populations, yet driven by a government that was preparing for a war it had not yet begun to fight. Both towns became, in a sense, waiting rooms for catastrophe. They were being made ready for something vast and terrible, though most of those who lived and worked within them could not yet fully comprehend the scale of what was approaching. The shadow lengthened as 1939 approached, falling across the harbour waters, across the shipyards, across the homes and streets of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, settling into the very foundations of these places like a cold that would not lift. The morning of September 1st, 1939, arrived in Kiel like any other autumn dawn, except it did not. The fog that rolled perpetually off the Baltic seemed thicker that day, or perhaps it only seemed so in memory. In the shipyards and naval barracks, men woke to a tension they had been trained to suppress but never quite managed. Orders had been circulating quietly for days. The U-boats were being readied, not for exercises, for something else. By afternoon, the docks themselves seemed to hold their breath. The Kiel fjord, that deep natural harbour that had cradled merchant vessels and warships through centuries of Baltic commerce, now became a staging ground. U-boats that had been fitting out in the covered halls and the open slips were being moved to their departure positions. The sound of diesel engines turning over for the first time in combat conditions carried across the water with a particular quality, a finality that no drill had quite prepared anyone for. It was not imagination that made the difference. These boats were leaving. They were not coming back to harbour for a very long time, and some of them would not come back at all, though no one standing on those docks could have spoken that fear aloud. Wilhelmshaven, on the North Sea coast, experienced the same undertow of activity. The harbour there, artificially carved from marshland and tidal flats a mere 80 years earlier, had been transformed into something altogether more industrial and purposeful. The U-boat pens that had been under construction for the past 4 years were now complete. Their massive concrete roofs designed to withstand anything the Allies might hurl from the air. The new dry docks that had been excavated with such ambition stood ready to receive boats requiring repair or overhaul. But on that first day of September, they were emptying rather than filling. The boats were departing in carefully staggered waves, a tactical dispersal that made strategic sense but created an eerie sense of sudden evacuation among the workers and families who lined the piers. The concept of the wolf pack, or Rudeltaktik as it was known in the German Navy, had only recently been codified into doctrine. Rather than sending U-boats out individually to hunt across the vast Atlantic, the new strategy grouped them in loose formations that would search for convoys together and communicate their positions by radio. This required precise timing, careful coordination, and boats that could depart from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven almost simultaneously, fanning out across the North Sea and then down toward the Atlantic Passage. The first such coordinated departure began in those early September days, and it represented something unprecedented in submarine warfare. No previous naval conflict had employed submarines in this manner, with such systematic organization, such mechanical efficiency. For the families gathered on the docks, the experience was one of compressed grief and controlled patriotism. Wives clutched children's hands. Mothers brought photographs to show sons they had raised in peacetime and were now seeing in uniform, bound for an unknown duration aboard machines that descended into crushing darkness. The German state had prepared propaganda materials celebrating the U-boat service, emphasizing its scientific precision and the careful training of its crews. But propaganda could not entirely mask the reality that these were young men, many in their early 20s, being sent into conditions that would test their courage and endurance in ways that peacetime had never demanded. The departure itself was highly formalized. Officers would inspect the crews. Final provisions would be loaded. There would be salutes, sometimes bands playing, sometimes an almost hushed quiet, broken only by the sound of water lapping against the U-boat's steel hull. The boats would maneuver slowly out of the harbour, their commanding officers familiar with every curve of the narrow channels they had traversed during training. Once clear of the breakwaters and into open water, they would turn northwest toward the Atlantic. The journey itself would take days, sometimes longer, depending on the particular patrol box they had been assigned and the anticipated location of convoy traffic. What the families left behind could not have known was that submarine warfare would follow a pattern of escalation and loss that would gradually hollow out the pool of experienced commanders and crews. The U-boat arm, the Unterseebootswaffe, had perhaps 6,000 men in active service at the war's outset. These were highly trained individuals who had spent years learning their craft during the rearmament years of the 1930s. The boats themselves, the Type Virk U-boats that formed the backbone of the fleet, were marvels of engineering, compact and deadly, but also cramped and claustrophobic. A crew of 44 men would spend anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks or longer in those confined spaces, breathing recycled air, performing maintenance tasks that required absolute precision, enduring the constant tension of knowing that a single mechanical failure or navigational miscalculation could result in being trapped beneath the surface with no means of escape. The first U-boats to depart from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven in those opening days of the war were not heading immediately into the densest areas of convoy traffic. Some were being positioned as a cordon around the British Isles. Others were being held back, strategically placed in case there was an immediate response from the British Navy. The German naval leadership, under the command of Admiral Erich Raeder, had hoped that Britain might sue for peace relatively quickly, or that the early shock of submarine attacks on merchant shipping might demoralize the British population into demanding a negotiated settlement. These were hopes more than realistic assessments, but they shaped the initial disposition of the U-boat fleet. On the docks of Kiel, as the days of early September passed, a peculiar mixture of pride and anxiety settled over the towns. The newspapers reported departures, sometimes with propaganda-friendly accounts that emphasized the skill and courage of the crews. But everyone who lived in those naval towns, everyone whose livelihood depended on the shipyards and the fleet, understood the true meaning of those departures. A war that had seemed distant and theoretical had suddenly become immediate. The harbour itself, which had been a place of work and tradition, had become a place of separation. The rhythm of the shipyards changed almost overnight. Now, instead of fitting out new U-boats according to a leisurely industrial schedule, the yards were being directed toward maximum production. New boats were being laid down in rapid succession. Construction schedules were compressed. The enormous technical challenge of building submarines to combat-ready standards was being further complicated by the demands of wartime production. Rivets were driven faster. Welds were inspected with protocols that balanced safety against speed. Every boat that could be completed and sent to sea was another asset in the struggle that nobody yet knew would last for 6 years. The first U-boats to encounter enemy vessels in those early weeks of the war found the experience shockingly abrupt. The British merchant marine was already beginning to adopt convoy procedures, and while the British Navy was understaffed and the anti-submarine warfare techniques were still being refined through hard experience, they were not helpless. Some U-boats reported successes, others reported encounters with armed merchant vessels or naval escorts. A few were damaged and forced to return to port, limping back to Kiel or Wilhelmshaven with torn pressure hulls or damaged diesel engines. These returning boats brought with them the first concrete evidence of what modern naval warfare actually felt like, stripped of the theoretical language of military doctrine. For the workers in the shipyards, the return of a damaged U-boat meant accelerated repair work under military supervision. For the families still waiting in the towns, the arrival of a boat in distress created both hope and dread. It meant that at least some of the crews were surviving, but it also meant that the danger was real and immediate. The machines that had seemed so impressive in their technical complexity, so carefully engineered and tested, were being challenged and sometimes broken by the realities of combat in the North Atlantic. The psychological weight of those early weeks settled gradually over Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. The towns were no longer simply naval bases maintaining a peacetime establishment. They had become instruments of warfare, places where the industrial capacity of the German state was being rapidly marshaled toward the production and deployment of submarines. The old traditions of naval service, which had carried forward from the imperial era through the interwar period and into the early Nazi rearmament years, were being tested and transformed. Young men who had joined the Navy in the idealistic fervor of the early 1930s, believing themselves to be serving their nation in a grand historical enterprise, were now discovering that this enterprise involved being sealed into a metal tube and sent to sea to attack merchant vessels that were often crewed by civilians whose only crime was carrying supplies to a nation that Germany had declared an enemy. The families left on the docks, watching the U-boats depart and the harbour gradually empty of the young men they had known all their lives, could not have grasped the full dimensions of the historical moment they were witnessing. They could only feel the separation, the uncertainty, and the slow dawning realization that the world had changed in a way that could not be reversed through hope or prayer or patriotic conviction. The fog that perpetually rolled off the Baltic and the North Sea seemed to carry away each departing boat into a future that was radically, utterly unknowable. To understand what those men endured, it's necessary to step inside the boat itself, not in imagination, but in the documented detail that submariners themselves recorded and later recalled. The Type Vic U-boat, the workhorse of the Atlantic, measured just over 200 feet in length. Inside that steel tube, between 40 and 50 men lived, worked, and slept for patrols that could stretch 6, 8, sometimes 10 weeks without surfacing for more than brief, dangerous moments. Consider the geometry of this: a beam of just over 20 feet wide and corridors so narrow that 2 men could barely pass without turning sideways. There was no separate officers' quarters, no galley apart from the crew's space, no privacy whatsoever. Everyone existed in the same recycled air, the same dimmed light, the same perpetual dampness that seemed to seep up from the bilges and settle into fabric and skin alike. The smell, according to those who survived such patrols, was unlike anything known in the world above. Diesel fuel, sharp, acrid, clinging to clothes and hair and fingernails, mingled with the scent of 40 unwashed bodies in a space designed for perhaps half that number comfortably, though comfort had no meaning in a U-boat. Add to this the smell of cooking, for there was always a cook working in the tiny galley, preparing meals as rich as possible, because caloric intake mattered when men were working 12-hour shifts in near-total darkness. Potato soup, one account describes, hard bread, canned sausage, coffee that never tasted quite right, because the water was drawn from tanks that absorbed everything around them, and beneath it all, the smell of sweat and fear and the peculiar mustiness that settled in when you closed the hatches and began to descend. The bunks deserve their own careful attention. In the forward torpedo room, where the youngest and newest recruits often slept, bunks were stacked 3 high in spaces barely wider than a coffin, and that comparison was not lost on those who lay in them. The mattresses were thin, often damp. A man would claim his bunk, leave it for his watch, and another sailor would take it immediately, the warmth still lingering. This was called hot bunking, and it meant that in a boat with 50 souls and perhaps 25 sleeping spaces, men rotated through rest like passengers on an endless shift. A petty officer might describe lying down in a bunk still warm from another's body, knowing that in 4 or 6 hours he would leave it and it would be claimed by someone else before the heat faded. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. There was no true rest, only brief intervals of semi-consciousness, punctuated by the constant thrum of the engines, the subtle creaks of the pressure hull, the hiss of the ventilation system. Water was always present, though not always in places where men wished it to be. The boat was perpetually damp. Condensation beaded on the steel walls and dripped steadily in certain compartments. A man's uniform was never entirely dry. The leather on belts and shoes grew soft and began to rot. Photographs and letters from home warped and faded. And yet, and this is crucial to understanding submarine life, the dampness was almost preferable to the alternative. A dry hull was a hull where rivets were loose, where the seals were failing, where the ocean was waiting. So men endured the moisture, the way it made everything slightly slimy to the touch, the way it encouraged mold and fungal infections on feet and in the folds of bodies pressed too close together for too long. The darkness was perhaps the most psychologically present of all environmental factors. When submerged during daylight hours, the interior of the boat was lit only by electric lamps, many of them hooded or dimmed to conserve power. In the control room, where the boat was navigated and commanded, a few instruments glowed with phosphorescent dials. Everywhere else the light was grey and insufficient. Men's eyes adapted poorly to this half-light, and when they surfaced at night and ventilated the boat, the sudden exposure to true darkness above the waves, starlight or moonlight, or the blank void of a stormy sky, was sometimes startling. The contrast between the grey electrical twilight of submerged life and the utter blackness of a night patrol created a peculiar disorientation that seemed never to fade, even after months of experience. The rhythm of time dissolved underwater. Without the sun, without the natural cycle of day and night, time became measured only by the watch schedule. 4 hours on, 8 hours off. Though off did not mean rest, it meant sleeping in a bunk with the constant vibration of the diesel engines, if the boat was running on the surface, or in utter stillness, if submerged and using electric motors. The silence during submerged patrols was perhaps the most profound element of the experience. Above, the engines of destroyers and corvettes could be heard through the hull, a sound that meant danger, that meant men on the surface hunting, that meant the boat must drift motionless until the threat passed. In those moments, a boat's crew did not simply remain silent. They held their breath collectively, understanding without words that a sound could mean death. The water above the hull was an enemy, pressing down with tremendous force, waiting for any weakness in the steel to express itself. Yet men adapted to this. The human mind is remarkably capable of normalization, even in circumstances that ought to feel impossible. Submariners reported playing chess in their narrow compartments, reading paperback books, writing letters home that they knew might never be sent. They sang softly, told jokes, fell into an almost meditative state during long patrols. Some developed what might be called a submarine consciousness, an acceptance of the fact that the boat was their entire world, that above and below were merely directions now. The officers maintained routine. They took celestial observations when they surfaced. They conducted drills. They kept logs in precise handwriting, knowing that order and discipline were the only things standing between survival and the chaos that lay outside the hull. Food, as mentioned, was used to maintain morale. A cook aboard a U-boat occupied a position of surprising importance. A good meal, though it consisted of simple ingredients and often limited variety, could lift spirits in a way difficult to explain to those who had never experienced genuine deprivation. A special soup on a man's birthday, an extra ration of butter on the bread. These small acts of humanity, performed in a space barely larger than a closet with water dripping from the overhead and 3 men waiting to use the galley space for their own cooking once the meal was finished, represented a form of collective care that sustained morale across weeks of danger and discomfort. And the danger was always present, even when it was not visible. The pressure hull, that double wall of steel that held back the ocean, was a constant presence in every submariner's awareness. A man did not need to think about it explicitly. The feeling was visceral. The depth gauge on the wall told the story. At certain depths, the pressure would increase beyond the design limit of the boat, and the hull would collapse as easily as a paper cup in a clenched fist. The boat had a test depth, a design depth beyond which it was not meant to go, and a crush depth, the theoretical limit at which the pressure would overcome the strength of the steel. Submariners spoke of these limits with a quiet fatalism. They understood that if the boat was attacked, if the boat was sinking, they were already dead. They simply might not know it immediately. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, there existed among submariners a peculiar form of camaraderie. These men lived more closely than soldiers in any other service. They knew each other's breathing patterns, their habits, their fears. When one man's concentration failed during a long watch, another would notice and gently take over. When homesickness threatened to spiral into despair, a quiet conversation in the crowded crew's quarters could restore equilibrium. This was not sentimentality. It was pragmatic survival. A submarine cannot function unless every man trusts every other man completely, unless every person on the boat knows that their survival is dependent on everyone else's competence, alertness, and courage. And this deep interdependence, maintained in a steel tube in the midst of the ocean, under constant threat, created bonds that few men in history have experienced in quite this form. While the Atlantic churned with diesel fumes and depth charges far above the surface, in the quiet halls of Kiel's shipyards and the cavernous workshops of Wilhelmshaven, a different kind of war was taking place. It was measured not in sinking tonnage or merchant ships sent to the bottom, but in steel plates and welded seams, in the careful orchestration of thousands of hands working in rhythm to birth a new U-boat every few days. The builders themselves rarely saw the ocean where their creations would hunt. Instead, they inhabited a world of specifications and deadlines, of quotas that seemed to multiply with each passing month as the Atlantic campaign intensified. By 1942, the Kriegsmarine had become obsessed with a single metric: how many submarines could be delivered from the yards. The High Command, observing the initial successes of the U-boat offensive, merchant ships sinking faster than they could be replaced, demanded more boats, always more boats. It was as if the tonnage war could be won through sheer production. Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, which had already become synonymous with submarine construction during the 1930s, now found themselves at the heart of a manufacturing frenzy that would reshape the towns entirely. The rhythm of the shipyards changed. Where once there had been careful, deliberate work, now there were shift rotations that bled into one another. 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, with workers arriving in the grey dawn and departing as evening settled over the fjord. The sound of riveting, that distinctive percussion that had become the heartbeat of both towns, now played almost continuously, echoing across Kiel Fjord and out over Jade Bay. Did the workers sense, in that relentless noise, that they were building something that would determine the outcome of the war itself? Perhaps. Perhaps they simply understood that their quota was not negotiable, that the Navy's appetite for submarines was insatiable, and that refusal was not an option available to them. The production figures grew with almost mathematical precision. In early 1942, both yards combined were launching perhaps 3 or 4 U-boats per month. By mid-year, that had crept toward 5. The engineering was becoming more standardized, more efficient. The Type VX submarine, the workhorse of the Atlantic campaign, could be broken down into sections that could be fabricated simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then assembled like a complex puzzle. The pressure hull, that crucial tube of steel that would protect the crew from the crushing depths, was constructed with painstaking care, each rivet and weld examined by quality inspectors who understood that a single weak point meant death for 40 men 1,000 meters down. But there is something deeply human about production quotas that asks the question of what happens when efficiency meets tragedy. For every U-boat that left the yard, there existed the statistical likelihood that it would not return. The builders knew this, or at least, those with access to operational reports understood it. Word filtered down through the hierarchies, passed in whispered conversations during lunch breaks and evening gatherings. A boat that had left 6 months ago would not be returning. Another had been rammed by a destroyer. A third had simply disappeared in the Atlantic, lost with all hands. Another silent grave in the dark water. The human cost was measurable, yet somehow distant from the yard itself. A U-boat crew, numbered around 50 men, sometimes fewer, depending on the boat's configuration and role. These were men who had walked the same docks where they had trained, who had eaten in the same canteens, who had lived in the worker housing scattered throughout both towns. They were local, many of them. They had grown up in Kiel or Wilhelmshaven. Their families still lived there. And when a boat was lost, the absence became a palpable presence in the community. Widows moved through the streets. Mothers aged overnight. Children asked questions that no one could answer with any certainty. Did their father suffer? Was it quick? These were the costs that did not appear in the production reports, the human arithmetic that balanced against each submarine successfully launched. By 1943, when the Atlantic campaign had reached its peak of intensity, the loss rate among U-boats was climbing steadily. Boats that left were not coming back with the frequency they once had. The convoy escort vessels had improved. The detection methods had advanced. The odds, quietly, had shifted against the submariners. And yet the quota remained. The yards continued their relentless rhythm. New U-boats rolled out with almost mechanical regularity, christened by ceremonial officers, handed over to proud captains and anxious crews who understood, with a clarity that surely weighed upon them, that their boat might be the next one to vanish into the Atlantic depths. The builders sent them off, these men in their grease-stained overalls and work caps, watching the launches with a mixture of professional pride and something deeper, perhaps unspoken, perhaps only felt in the moment, before turning back to their benches. The contradiction was almost unbearable if one stopped to contemplate it for too long. To build something with such precision and care, to put weeks of labor into the construction of a machine that was intended to be operated by men you might know, to see that machine sail away, knowing with reasonable statistical certainty that you would never see it again. This was the daily reality of the shipyard workers in 1943 and 1944. They were not soldiers, yet they were entirely part of the war machine. They were not in danger of being sunk, yet their work ensured that others would be. The pressure of the quotas mounted. As the war progressed, the attrition rate among completed U-boats grew more and more severe. Fewer boats were returning, which meant fewer boats were being refitted and redeployed. The mathematics of production began to work against itself. How many boats would need to be built to replace those lost? How many would need to be built to maintain an effective fighting force? The Navy demanded more, always more, and the yards obliged, driven by a combination of patriotic duty, professional pride, and the simple reality that refusal was not permitted in Nazi Germany. By late 1943, it was becoming clear to many, though not to all, and not to those in positions of command who maintained their illusions, that the tide had turned in the Atlantic. The U-boat was losing its dominance. The convoy system was becoming more effective. The Allied Navy was adapting faster than the submarine force could evolve. And still, the orders came. Build more boats, launch them faster, improve the designs where possible, but do not slow production. The war had to be won, or at least, it had to be fought until it could not be fought any longer. The workers in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven continued their shift work, their riveting and welding, their careful assemblies and precise measurements. They built boats that would be crewed by men who would face an increasingly hostile Atlantic. They built machines of war with the knowledge, growing steadily heavier as the months passed, that they were building tombs. And yet there was no alternative presented to them. The quotas were the quotas. The boats had to be built. The war had to be prosecuted to its conclusion, whatever that might be. In the quieter moments, and there were fewer of these as 1944 approached, a builder might pause and wonder about the men who would take his boat to sea. Would they survive? Would they bring it back? Would anyone know what happened to them? These were questions that had no comfortable answers, and so they often went unasked, relegated to the privacy of evening thoughts or the solitude of the journey home after a shift. The job was the job. The quota was the quota. And the Atlantic, indifferent and vast, continued its patient work of claiming both U-boats and the men who sailed in them. By the spring of 1942, the towns that had grown so deliberately, so purposefully, around their harbours began to understand that they had constructed something the Allied air forces would not ignore. The shipyards of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven were no longer distant industrial abstractions on maps in distant capitals. They were targets, precise, invaluable, deadly targets. The first major raids came as the war had already begun its long, grinding shift against Germany. At night, the sound that had once been the comforting ring of hammers and the hiss of welding torches gave way to something else entirely, the distant drone of engines in formation, growing closer, then suddenly overhead. Searchlights would sweep the darkness, and then came the sound that every civilian in those towns learned to dread, the whistle of falling bombs. Consider what the Allied planners saw when they looked down at those harbours from above. In Kiel, the Deutsche Werke and the Hauptwalzwerke shipyards sprawled across square kilometres of waterfront. These were not small operations. They were among the most sophisticated naval construction facilities in the world. Wilhelmshaven's yards were equally critical, perhaps even more so as a fleet base. The Kriegsmarine depended on these two cities to replace its losses, to build its future, to imagine its survival. Destroy them, the calculations went, and you throttle the German Navy's capacity to wage war at sea. The bombing campaign intensified through 1943 and into 1944. A single raid in 1944, August to be specific, would drop more tonnage of explosives on Kiel than had fallen in all the previous raids combined. Imagine for a moment what that means. Tens of thousands of bombs, hundreds of aircraft. The sky itself turned orange with fire, and the sound was not the sharp crack of individual explosions, but a kind of continuous, rolling roar, as if the earth itself was groaning. The shipyards did not burn with the same uniform intensity as wooden cities might have. They burned in ways that were almost architectural in their deliberation. A direct hit on a slipway would destroy months of work in an instant. A bomb through the roof of a covered building hall, and these halls were enormous, cathedral-like structures, would turn precision machinery into twisted metal. The docks themselves became landscapes of crater and wreckage. Floating docks sank, cranes toppled. The careful infrastructure of maritime construction was methodically, relentlessly dismantled from the sky. Yet something remarkable happened in the aftermath. The workers, and there were tens of thousands of them, would emerge from shelters when the all-clear sounded and begin again. This was not simple patriotism, though some of that existed. It was not coercion alone, though that was present too. There was something else, a strange, almost stubborn rhythm to human resilience that operates even in catastrophe. The shipyards had become these people's world. Their fathers and grandfathers had built them. They knew the yard's geometry as intimately as they knew their own homes. And in the twisted logic of war, reconstruction was work. Work was normalcy. Work was survival. The repair efforts became exercises in extraordinary improvisation. A bombed-out section of a shipyard would be cordoned off, and workers would begin clearing rubble by hand. New temporary workshops would be erected using salvaged materials. When heavy machinery was destroyed, lighter methods replaced them, more laboriously, but still forward-moving. The submarine construction that had become the primary focus of both yards, for U-boats were easier to conceal and required less physical infrastructure than capital ships, would continue in smaller, dispersed workshops, often in caves or heavily camouflaged underground facilities. The Germans had learned a bitter lesson about centralization. In Kiel itself, the civilian population endured something more intimate than the shipyard workers did. Neighborhoods surrounding the yards were flattened systematically. Whole blocks of worker housing, the very communities that had grown up around the maritime industry, simply ceased to exist. Families who had lived in those areas for generations found themselves homeless, their possessions reduced to ash. The Kieler Altstadt, the old town that had watched over the fjord for centuries, was devastated. Beautiful buildings, irreplaceable structures, reduced to rubble by midday. One might ask, how do people continue living in a place being systematically destroyed? The answer, drawn from accounts and testimony, is both simple and complex. Where else would they go? For many workers, their expertise was valuable only there. Their homes, even when destroyed, were still legally theirs, emotionally theirs. Temporary shelters and overcrowded communal housing became the norm. Bombed-out families lived with relatives, or in hastily constructed barracks, or in caves dug into hillsides outside the city. They traveled to work, what remained of work, on damaged trains or by bicycle through streets lined with debris. The bombing did not break the willingness of the German war machine to continue production. It slowed it, fractured it, dispersed it, but did not stop it. This was partly because the yards themselves, despite enormous damage, were remarkably resilient. Ship construction requires massive investment in infrastructure, but once that infrastructure exists, it can be repaired or partially replaced with surprising speed, especially when driven by military necessity. The organization and discipline that had built the yards in the first place now applied itself to keeping them functioning under duress. By 1945, however, the mathematics had become impossible. The bombing was now nearly constant. The shipyards were operating at a fraction of their capacity. The workers themselves were exhausted, malnourished, traumatized by living under continuous threat. And the larger strategic situation was dissolving. Germany was losing the war on all fronts. The notion that these yards could rebuild or replace anything seemed almost abstract, a remnant of planning from a time when victory had seemed possible. What remained, in those final months, was less a functioning naval construction enterprise and more a landscape of survival and memory. The workers would come, if they could. They would attempt repairs, undertake small projects, maintain a facade of operational activity. But everyone involved understood, on some level that remained unspoken, that this was the ending. The ships being built would never be completed. The U-boats in their slips would never go to sea. The future that these two towns had been built to serve was closing. And yet there is something curiously human in what happened in the rubble during those final bombing campaigns. Even as walls fell around them, even as the war became plainly unwinnable, the workers of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven continued to show up, continued to work, continued to rebuild what had been destroyed, knowing, perhaps without fully admitting it to themselves, that the world they were rebuilding would not exist by war's end. That strange combination of habit, necessity, duty, and the simple human need to have purpose in one's day, that drove them forward. The rubble itself became a kind of landscape of resilience, piled stone and twisted metal, that stood as testimony to both the power of destruction and the quiet, persistent will to continue. By early 1945, the harbours at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven had become landscapes of surrender rather than ambition. The great shipyards that had hummed with such purpose, that had launched warship after warship into the Baltic and North Sea, now stood half destroyed by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The covered building halls where U-boats had been constructed with meticulous precision were skeletal frames open to the sky, and yet the work continued, slower now, more desperate. Workers arrived each morning through streets lined with rubble, stepping over the debris of their own neighborhoods to help complete boats that everyone understood would likely never return. The Soviet advance from the east had begun in earnest. By February, the Red Army was moving into East Prussia. The sound of distant artillery became a steady presence on the horizon, felt more than heard at first, then gradually growing louder with each passing week. In Kiel, people could sometimes hear the guns. The town had already endured 4 years of relentless air raids. Entire districts had been reduced to ash. Wilhelmshaven on the North Sea coast faced its own particular horror, for it sat exposed, vulnerable to sudden bombardment from the sea as well as the sky. The German navy that had once commanded these waters with such pride was now in fragments. The great capital ships that had survived, and there were pitifully few, were either already at the bottom of the sea or waiting in harbours for the final blow. The U-boat fleet represented the last tangible instrument of German naval power, and so the pressure to produce them intensified even as the war became mathematically unwinnable. Perhaps one might slip through. Perhaps one might accomplish something that would matter. It is a small human detail, but it helps explain why men continued to work in those halls, why they continued to risk the journey through bombed-out streets to their stations. There was still a possibility, however remote, that their labor might change something. Or perhaps they simply had no alternative. The regime's reach, though weakening, was still long, and many workers had families to think of. By March and April of 1945, the reality had become undeniable. German military forces were collapsing on every front. The Americans and British were crossing the Rhine. The Soviets were entering German territory from the east. The Luftwaffe, once a fearsome engine of war, was essentially grounded. There was no fuel, no pilots worth preserving. The Navy, which had once harbored ambitions of global reach, now thought only of survival. And so began something that might be called the dissolution. Some vessels were scuttled deliberately, sent to the bottom by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were abandoned in harbours as the officers realized there was nowhere left to run. The U-boats, those ghost ships that had terrorized the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, began to surrender in ones and twos or in groups, limping into neutral ports or approaching the Allies under white flags. It was not a dramatic capitulation. It was quiet, exhausted. In Kiel harbour, in the final days before German surrender, the water became a graveyard of iron and memory. Ships that had been built with such care, vessels that represented the engineering skill and industrial output of entire regions, were deliberately rammed onto the bottom, their hull plating torn open to let in the water, to let in the sea. Some captains did this with a kind of ritual solemnity, understanding they were presiding over the death of an epoch. Others simply left their posts and walked away, leaving junior officers or enginemen to make the terrible decision. What do you do when you are ordered to sink the very thing you have spent months maintaining? The question echoes backward through time even now. Wilhelmshaven's harbour presented a similar scene of dissolution. The dry docks that had been so carefully engineered to cradle the great warships of the Kriegsmarine stood empty or were turned, toward the end, into makeshift air raid shelters. The U-boat pens, those massive concrete bunkers that had survived countless bombing raids, their walls so thick that even the heaviest bombs could not penetrate them, became monuments to a vanished world. New U-boats were still being completed inside them, but completed to what end? To be surrendered? To slip out into a sea already controlled by enemy navies? The men who finished these boats knew the answer, and yet they finished them anyway. There are accounts from workers in both towns of a peculiar unreality settling over those final weeks. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. And yet the machinery of command continued to function. Orders still came down, and men still reported for work. Some of this was habit, some of it was fear, but there was also something else, a kind of stubborn adherence to duty, even as the entire structure that had given meaning to that duty was collapsing. In Kiel's covered shipyards, despite the damage, a U-boat was launched as late as April 1945. Think on that fact. While Soviet artillery was audible on the eastern horizon, while the city was largely in ruins, while the regime itself was days away from total collapse, a new submarine was launched. The surrender documents for Germany were signed on May 7th and 8th, 1945, but in the harbours of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, the actual surrender happened more slowly, more confusingly. Units of the German Navy still existed. Some were still at sea when the order came. Others were in harbour, their crews uncertain whether to obey the command to cease all military operations, or whether the order itself was legitimate. In the chaos of a collapsing government, legitimacy became slippery. Communications broke down. Some vessels received orders to scuttle themselves. Others received contradictory orders. A handful of U-boats, even after the surrender, attempted to flee. One famous instance saw Kapitan Karl Dönitz himself, the Grand Admiral who had overseen the entire U-boat campaign, attempting to establish some kind of government in exile, a notion so divorced from reality that it lasted only a few days before being dissolved by military necessity. The U-boats that remained in harbour at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven when the surrender came represented something unique in naval history. They were the technological pinnacle of German engineering in many respects. The newer types, the Type XT-1 and Type Tengs III boats, were revolutionary designs that might, in a different war, in a different time, have changed the balance of naval power. But they arrived too late. Most were never even commissioned before the war ended. Some were scuttled by their own crews, sent to the bottom in the harbours where they had been born. Others were captured intact by the Allies, who were fascinated by their design and would spend years studying them, dissecting them, learning from them. The quiet that fell over both harbours in May 1945 must have been almost unimaginable to those who had lived through the previous years. The constant rhythm of industrial work, the hammering of riveters, the welding torches, the movement of great machines, simply ceased. The docks that had been crowded with workers and soldiers and sailors now stood mostly empty. The fjords and harbours filled with the hulks of vessels, some sunk deliberately, some abandoned, some waiting in a kind of limbo to discover what their fate would be. The water that had been churned by propellers and disturbed by the launching of ships now lay calmer, though slicks of oil and other residue marked where so much steel and ambition had been put to rest. There is a particular melancholy in the image of a U-boat being scuttled, deliberately sunk by the very men who had built it, or crewed it, or commanded it. The ballast tanks that had been designed with such precision to control the boat's position in the water, to allow it to rise and sink on command, were now opened to the sea for the last time. The diesel engines that had driven it across the Atlantic were silenced forever. The torpedo tubes, perhaps never even used in anger, were sealed against the water that now claimed the vessel. Men watched this happen, and many of them would carry the image with them for the rest of their lives. In the surrounding towns, civilians emerged from their shelters and their rubble-strewn homes into a landscape that was almost unrecognizable. Kiel, once a proud and growing city, had been reduced to perhaps 30% of its former self by bombing. Entire neighborhoods were simply gone. The Baroque cathedral, one of the few medieval structures, stood damaged but still standing. The townspeople, exhausted, hungry, grieving the many dead, now faced the arrival of occupying forces. In Wilhelmshaven, the situation was similarly bleak. The marshland that had been so carefully reclaimed, that had been transformed into a modern harbour city through engineering and willpower, was now in ruins. The great shipyards stood as monuments to a vanished era. And the U-boats? Some would be raised from the harbours in the coming months and years. Some would be cut up for scrap, their revolutionary designs dissected and learned from by the victorious powers. A few would be preserved, carefully restored even, to be displayed as museums, as monuments to a particular kind of technological ambition and human courage and human tragedy. They became relics, tourist attractions, reminders of a chapter of history that everyone wished could be closed and forgotten. But in those first hours and days after the surrender, in those particular moments when the guns fell silent and the hammering stopped and the smoke began to clear, the harbour towns of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven existed in a strange suspension. The war was over. The Kriegsmarine no longer existed. And yet, in a sense, both harbours remained full of its ghosts. The rusting hulks of ships, the empty docks, the skeletal remains of shipyards, the workers walking away from their final shifts through streets that no longer resembled the places they had left home from each morning. What does a city do when the entire reason for its modern existence has been erased? That question hung over both harbours as the days of May 1945 turned into weeks, as the occupation began, as the slow, necessary work of transformation from instruments of war into something else entirely began to take shape. The silence that descended on Kiel and Wilhelmshaven when the fighting ended was not the silence of peace, but rather the holding of breath before an uncertain future. In May of 1945, as the unconditional surrender was signed, British and American forces moved into the shattered harbour towns with deliberate caution. What they found were landscapes transformed by years of war into something almost unrecognizable. The shipyards still smoldered. Cranes hung at broken angles over empty dry docks where U-boats had once been assembled in rows like iron fish in a mechanical stream. The streets of both towns bore the scars of relentless bombing campaigns that had reduced decades of civilian neighborhoods to rubble and ash. Yet beneath this devastation, something endured. The fundamental infrastructure of the harbours remained, scarred but intact. The fjord itself was unchanged, still deep and sheltered as it had been for centuries. The occupation authorities faced an immediate and profound question as they walked through these ruins. How does one transform a machine built entirely for war into something that might serve a peacetime economy? It was not merely a matter of removing military equipment or lowering flags. The entire social, industrial, and cultural identity of both towns had been woven so completely around naval construction and fleet operations that peacetime seemed almost a foreign concept to those who had grown up there. Workers who had known only the rhythm of warship construction found themselves without purpose. Engineers who had devoted their careers to submarine design were suddenly citizens of a nation forbidden from building submarines. Entire families whose livelihoods depended on the dockyards faced an abyss of uncertainty. The occupation began with a curious mixture of practical necessity and ideological intent. The British took primary control of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, viewing them as strategic assets to be carefully managed in the emerging Cold War landscape. There were Allied representatives, military governors, and administrative officers who moved into requisitioned buildings overlooking the harbours. There were inspections of the remaining shipyard infrastructure, detailed assessments of what machinery might be salvaged or repurposed, and careful deliberation about what should be dismantled as reparations. The Treaty of Versailles after the First World War had placed harsh restrictions on German naval construction, but those restrictions had been violated and ultimately rendered meaningless by the rearmament of the 1930s. Now, a new set of restrictions would be imposed, and this time they were enforced by troops and international oversight. The reconstruction of both towns proceeded in phases, each one slower and more painful than the last. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the priority was survival rather than revival. The harbours had to be cleared of wreckage. Sunken ships were raised or broken apart. The channels were dredged. Destroyed sections of the docks were removed to make way for temporary structures. Rubble from the bombed neighbourhoods was sorted, with usable bricks and stones salvaged for rebuilding, while the rest was pushed into the harbour itself to create new foundations. This was backbreaking, unglamorous work, performed often by displaced persons, prisoners of war still being held, and the local population themselves, many of whom were malnourished and exhausted by years of conflict. The shipyard workers, in particular, faced an unexpected reprieve. While submarine construction and new warship building were strictly forbidden by the occupation authorities, the yards themselves were deemed valuable assets that might be retrained toward commercial purposes. The Allies recognized that Germany would eventually need to rebuild its economy, and shipbuilding was an essential industry. Slowly, tentatively, the yards were reopened not for warships, but for the repair and conversion of damaged vessels. A U-boat hull might be refashioned into a merchant ship. A damaged freighter could be restored to use. The skills that had built the most advanced submarines in the world were redirected toward the humble work of keeping merchant traffic flowing. It was a humbling transition for many who had taken pride in military innovation, but it was work, and work meant survival. Kiel's transition began in earnest in 1946, when the British military government authorized limited shipyard operations focused on civilian repairs and conversions. The massive covered building halls where U-boats had been assembled in rows were now used for more modest projects. The workers who returned to the yards found them strange and diminished, like familiar rooms seen through a shrinking glass. Their tools were still there, their skills remained in their hands. But the purpose had shifted entirely. They were rebuilding, not building, and there was something both deflating and strangely peaceful about that distinction. The young men who had worked under intense pressure during the war, racing to meet production quotas for boats that would not survive, now worked at a measured pace on civilian repairs. Some found this new rhythm restful. Others struggled with a sense of diminishment. Wilhelmshaven's transformation followed a similar, if slightly different trajectory. As the primary home port of the High Seas Fleet, and later the Kriegsmarine, Wilhelmshaven had been considered a crucial strategic asset by the Allies. The British occupation authorities had plans for the harbour that extended beyond mere civilian reconstruction. It was to become, over time, a key naval base for the emerging Western security structures that would eventually coalesce into NATO. This meant that while the civilian shipyards faced the same restrictions and redirections as Kiel's, Wilhelmshaven maintained a stronger military presence and infrastructure. Naval officers began arriving to oversee British naval operations in the region. New facilities were quietly constructed or repurposed for Allied use. The harbour that had been so silent in the months immediately following surrender began to fill again with ships, though now they bore different flags. The civilian population of both towns moved through these early post-war years in a kind of suspended state. Food was strictly rationed. Housing was desperately scarce, with thousands of families crammed into whatever structures had survived the bombing or hastily erected temporary shelters. The winter of 1946 and 1947 was particularly harsh, with coal shortages and inadequate heating turning that season into one of genuine hardship and suffering. Yet slowly, through mechanisms that combined Marshall Plan aid with local effort, conditions began to improve. By 1948 and 1949, small shops reopened. bakeries returned to normal hours. Schools reopened their doors, and children who had grown up knowing only war began to experience something approaching ordinary childhood. The invisible boundary between wartime and peacetime, which had seemed so sharp in May of 1945, became increasingly blurred as months passed and life reasserted its everyday rhythms. The dockworkers and shipyard labourers, who had carried the intimate weight of building the Kriegsmarine's most famous weapons, now carried a different sort of burden, one of transformation and adaptation. A man who had spent 5 years perfecting the assembly of torpedo tubes might find himself training younger workers in general metal fabrication for merchant vessel repairs. An engineer who had designed pressure hull sections for submarines was now solving problems related to cargo handling systems for converted freighters. There was no fanfare in these transitions, no ceremonies marking the shift from war to peace. It simply happened, day by day, one job following another, one skill being repurposed into a slightly different channel. The return of merchant shipping to Kiel and Wilhelmshaven was perhaps the most visible and psychologically significant marker of the town's transition back toward peaceful normalcy. Ships began appearing in the harbours that were not warships, that carried not weapons but goods. Scandinavian traders returned tentatively at first, then with increasing regularity. Dutch merchants, Belgian shippers, even a few British and American commercial vessels began to appear at the docks. The sight of a merchant ship with a hull full of grain or timber or manufactured goods represented something almost revolutionary to those who had known only military vessels and the constant preparations for war. Cranes that had lifted torpedo components and submarine sections now hoisted sacks of coffee and crates of machinery from other lands. The water itself seemed to carry a different quality. What emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, was a new identity for both towns. They would never again be primarily military shipyards in the way they had been before the war. That era had ended decisively, but they need not remain broken either. Kiel transformed itself into a commercial shipyard and an important Baltic trading port. Wilhelmshaven likewise shifted towards civilian maritime activities, though it retained a more pronounced military element due to its location and allied strategic interests. Both towns, scarred and diminished in some ways, began to discover that they possessed resources beyond warfare. Their harbours were deep and sheltered. Their workers possessed extraordinary skills. Their locations on major trade routes remained geographically advantageous. The very infrastructure that had been built for war could, with time and intention, be redirected toward peaceful commerce. By the early 1950s, a visitor to either harbour would have witnessed scenes that would have been almost unimaginable a few years earlier. Families strolling along restored docks, children playing in rebuilded parks, market stalls appearing in squares where rubble had been cleared. The smell of the harbour changed subtly as well, from the acrid burn of war industry to the salt and oil and rope characteristic of ordinary maritime commerce. Fishing boats began returning to waters they had abandoned years before. Coastal trade resumed its ancient patterns. The fjord that had cradled warships now cradled merchant vessels and increasingly smaller craft belonging to citizens who wished simply to sail for pleasure or sustenance. The psychological transformation of the populations was, in some ways, more profound than the physical reconstruction. An entire generation had grown up believing that the purpose of their towns, the meaning of their existence, was bound to military power and naval dominion. Now, that narrative had been decisively rejected. The very idea that Kiel and Wilhelmshaven could or should build warships was forbidden, monitored, and enforced by foreign military occupation. This prohibition, which might have seemed unbearably harsh in the immediate aftermath of war, gradually became accepted as a necessary, and perhaps even welcome boundary. The towns and their people had tried the path of military industrialization to its logical conclusion and found only devastation. Perhaps there was a thought that moved quietly through conversations and consciousness. There might be another way. Perhaps civilian maritime life, ordinary commerce, modest prosperity, built on trade rather than conquest, might be not only possible but preferable. The rebuilding of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven was not a story of rapid recovery or triumphant restoration. It was slower, more hesitant, more ambiguous than that. It was a story of adaptation, of workers learning to apply their skills in new directions, of towns learning to imagine themselves differently than they had for decades. And in that slow, patient work of reconstruction lay perhaps the beginning of a genuine peace. Not the enforced peace of occupation and restriction, but the deeper peace that comes from choosing a different path, from building something other than instruments of war. The armistice that came in 1945 left both towns suspended in a peculiar silence. The harbours of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, which had thrummed for generations with the sound of industry and the expectation of war, fell suddenly quiet. The rubble remained. The burned-out workshops still smouldered in places. But within months, the machinery of occupation began its slow work, and within years, something unexpected began to grow in the spaces where the Kriegsmarine had once ruled absolutely. New purposes would find their way to these ancient ports. Not the purposes anyone had imagined, perhaps, but genuine ones nonetheless. The division of Germany created an immediate and profound geography of consequence. Wilhelmshaven, situated on the North Sea coast deep within what would become West Germany, found itself transformed almost overnight into a strategic asset for the Atlantic Alliance. The harbour that had launched U-boats into the Atlantic now began to shelter vessels of a different order. NATO navies began to arrive. The Federal German Navy, the Bundesmarine, was formally established in 1955, and Wilhelmshaven became once again a home port. Not for the vast fleets of the Kaiser or the Führer, but for a measured, controlled maritime presence bound by alliance and treaty. The docks were rebuilt. New slipways rose where old ones had been demolished. The shipyard workers, many of them the sons and grandsons of men who had built destroyers and U-boats, returned to their trades under fundamentally different circumstances. They built vessels for NATO. They built minesweepers and frigates. They built ships meant to defend a coast rather than dominate an ocean. It was, in many ways, a quieter kind of work, less grandiose, less haunted by imperial ambition. Kiel, by contrast, lay further to the east, nestled deeper into what would eventually become the border between West and East Germany. For several years after the war, this ambiguity of position created genuine uncertainty about the town's future. Would it fall entirely into Soviet hands? Would it be divided? The suspense was resolved gradually, but never entirely cleanly. When the Federal Republic emerged, Kiel remained within it, though barely. The proximity to the inner German border meant that the town lived for decades with a particular kind of awareness, a consciousness of being a frontline city in ways both literal and psychological. Yet even here, naval tradition reasserted itself. The Bundesmarine, constrained by international agreement to operate only in home waters, established a significant presence at Kiel. The submarine school was relocated there. Training facilities were built. The quiet Baltic waters that had once sheltered U-boats training for Atlantic patrols now became the practice grounds for a new generation of German sailors operating within strict limits and under international supervision. The town, in its way, returned to what it had been before the grand militarism of the 20th century. A naval centre, yes, but one integrated into a larger European order rather than seeking to dominate it. The shipyards themselves underwent a metamorphosis that took decades to complete. In Kiel, the sprawling Friedrich Krupp Germaniawerft, which had built submarines throughout both World Wars and the interwar period, survived the conflict in a battered state, but survived it nonetheless. The Nazi regime had invested tremendous resources in dispersing and hardening submarine production, which meant that even the heaviest bombing could not entirely destroy the capacity to build them. After the war, the yard faced an identity crisis. There were no more U-boats to build for Germany. There would never be U-boats to build for Germany again in the foreseeable future. Slowly, the yard pivoted. It began to build commercial vessels, container ships, general cargo vessels, tankers. The skilled workforce that had once assembled pressure hulls and torpedo tubes now fitted containers and welded commercial plating. The rhythm of the yard changed. The urgency changed. The existential stakes changed profoundly. It was work, and it was noble work in its way, but it was work stripped of the historical drama that had surrounded it for so long. Wilhelmshaven, similarly transformed, became in time a centre not only of naval activity, but of the merchant fleet as well. The old German shipping lines, rebuilding from nothing, gradually reconstituted themselves. They used the yards at Wilhelmshaven. They used the deep harbours and the modern facilities that had been painstakingly restored. The North Sea coast, which the Nazis had dreamed of dominating militarily, instead became a bustling commercial highway. Container traffic grew, oil tankers called regularly, the harbours filled with the ordinary commerce of a peacetime economy, participating in international trade. One might wonder whether this felt like a defeat to the old shipyard workers, seeing merchant vessels where warships had once launched. Perhaps some felt that way, but others may have experienced it as a kind of liberation. The ships they built would no longer carry men to their deaths, would no longer be pursued by enemy aircraft or hunted by opposing navies, would simply engage in the honest work of moving goods and people across the water. The Cold War, once it crystallized in the 1950s and 1960s, created a peculiar permanent condition for both towns. They were, in effect, demonstration cities. Wilhelmshaven showed the Western Alliance what German maritime expertise could achieve within democratic and treaty-bound constraints. The harbour became a symbol, in a quiet way, of German reintegration into the Western world. Foreign dignitaries visited. NATO exercises used the port. The Bundesmarine's presence there was a constant, visible reassurance to West Germany's allies that the country's naval power had been tamed, professionalized, and rendered compatible with international order. Kiel, closer to the frontier, embodied a different symbolism. It was a Western city living in proximity to the Eastern Bloc. The Naval Academy there, the training schools, the shipyards producing for NATO and NATO allies, all of these existed in a kind of careful tension. One was always aware, in Kiel during the Cold War, that the frontier existed, that behind the invisible line of the inner German border lay a very different world. The town took on some of the character of a frontier post, even as it remained thoroughly integrated into the West. In the 1960s and 1970s, something remarkable began to happen in both towns, almost quietly, almost without official announcement. Historical consciousness began to reassert itself, not as nostalgia for the Nazi era, that would have been unthinkable, and Germany's commitment to historical reckoning made such nostalgia intellectually and morally impossible, but as a genuine attempt to understand what had happened, to preserve evidence of the past, to ensure that future generations could learn from it. Museums began to be established. In Kiel, exhibits were created documenting the town's medieval origins, its rise as a naval power, its transformation through the wars of the 20th century. In Wilhelmshaven, similar efforts were underway. These were not museums that celebrated militarism or war. Rather, they were institutions committed to honest historical representation. They showed both the technical achievements and the human costs. They preserved artifacts. They collected oral histories. They created spaces where visitors could contemplate what had occurred without propagandistic framing. The most evocative symbols of this historical reclamation, however, were the submarines themselves. In the 1960s and again in subsequent decades, several U-boats that had survived the war were designated as museum ships and monuments. The most famous of these is the Type Vic U-995, which now rests permanently at the Naval Memorial in Le Beau, near Kiel, where it can be boarded and explored by visitors. Walking through such a vessel, one becomes acutely aware of the cramped conditions in which men lived and worked and died, the narrow torpedo tubes, the impossibly small crew quarters, the diesel engines that heated the interior to stifling temperatures, the periscope that represented the submarine's only contact with the surface world. There is something deeply moving about standing in such a space, knowing that the men who occupied it faced not only the physical confinement, but the constant awareness that the surrounding water could become a tomb at any moment. Other U-boats were similarly preserved or sunk as monuments in various locations. In Kiel itself, the former submarine U-95 was once displayed, though the preservation of multiple boats has sometimes presented both practical and emotional challenges. The decision to sink a vessel deliberately, to make it a memorial on the harbour floor, is not undertaken lightly. It represents a kind of acknowledgement, a permanent statement that this object matters, that what happened here will not be forgotten, that memory itself has value. These preserved U-boats function in the modern era as strange monuments. They are not exactly memorials in the traditional sense. They do not primarily commemorate those who died, though they certainly evoke that awareness. Rather, they preserve in three-dimensional form the material reality of what was built and used. They prevent abstraction. You cannot understand the Battle of the Atlantic the same way after you have stood in the torpedo room of a U-boat and felt the closeness of the walls around you. You cannot understand the industrial capacity of Nazi Germany in quite the same way after you have walked through a reconstructed shipyard workspace and seen the precision tools, the engineering drawings, the carefully organized labor processes that made submarine construction possible. The boats become, in effect, windows into a past that might otherwise recede into comfortable distance. The museums and memorials that grew around them in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven have continued to develop and expand through the decades since the Cold War's end. The German Technical Museum at the naval base in Kiel houses an extraordinary collection of naval artifacts and historical materials. The German Navy Memorial at Le Beau serves as a place of quiet reflection. Wilhelmshaven's Jade Bay Museum documents the history of the harbour and the communities that have depended on it. These institutions, almost without exception, approach their subject matter with intellectual rigour and moral seriousness. They do not shy away from difficult questions. They do not attempt to make the Nazi regime sympathetic, but they also do not reduce history to simple moral narratives. They preserve complexity. They honour the technical achievement while acknowledging the catastrophic consequences of the political order that demanded such achievement. The Cold War, which lasted until 1989, meant that both Kiel and Wilhelmshaven remained active naval centres throughout that entire period. The Bundesmarine continued to train and operate from both ports. International tensions occasionally spiked, and one would occasionally read reports of Soviet submarines detected in the waters off Schleswig-Holstein. The proximity of the frontier kept a certain alertness present, but on the ground, daily life proceeded. Families grew up in these towns. Children went to school. Workers went to shipyards and naval bases. Ordinary time accumulated. The dramatic events of earlier decades became history, then became memory, then began to time. If you were to stand on the modern waterfront of Kiel today, In the hour just before dusk, you would find yourself surrounded by a silence that feels almost reverent. The Kiel fjord still moves beneath the sky much as it did 800 years ago, when merchants first learned to read its tides and sheltered their wooden hulls against the winter storms. The water is still there. The geography has not changed. And yet everything that once crowded these shores with urgency and iron has settled into something quieter, something that allows you to hear the actual sound of the harbour rather than the memory of it. The shipyards remain, but they build differently now. Container ships and ferries and research vessels slip down the ways where U-boat hulls once emerged like grey ghosts into uncertain fates. Workers still come each morning, as their ancestors did, and the rhythm of maritime construction continues, unbroken across generations. But the keels being laid now will carry families on holiday and scientific expeditions. The metal clanging through the shipyard today does not carry the same weight of impossible choice that it once did. Walk the streets of both towns, and you will find museums where you can descend into the belly of preserved submarines, cramped and cold, and somehow more real than any historical text could make them. The U-995, resting now in Labo on the Kiel fjord, sits like a sleeping animal that will never dive again. Inside, you can touch the periscope and feel how narrow the command center was, how the men who steered these vessels operated in absolute darkness except for the glow of instruments. The sensation is not frightening in the way it once was. It is, rather, instructive. It teaches you something about the ordinary human beings who faced extraordinary circumstances in spaces barely wider than a coffin. Wilhelmshaven, too, has changed its character without forgetting its past. The great dry docks that once hummed with military purpose now service civilian vessels, and the bunkers that sheltered those who worked through the bombing campaigns have become museums and archives. In some of them, if you are quiet enough, you can almost hear the echoes of air raid sirens, though they exist now only in the stories of those who lived through them, and the careful records of historians who have documented every night of destruction. What strikes you, if you sit by the water for long enough, is how the harbour continues. That is perhaps the deepest truth about these places. They are not monuments to what happened here. They are, rather, living reminders that the towns themselves survived and chose to move forward. The fjord did not change its character because of the war. The people did, and having survived that transformation, they carried forward a kind of quiet dignity that does not proclaim itself loudly. The ferry that crosses between Kiel and Scandinavia leaves at regular intervals, much as merchant vessels have done for more than a millennium. Commuters take it for granted as they board with their coffee and their luggage, just as workers once boarded smaller boats to reach the shipyards. The continuity is almost invisible in its ordinariness, and yet it represents something profound. The waters that once carried warships toward battles now carry ordinary people toward ordinary lives, and this transition, peaceful and unmarked by ceremony, is itself a kind of triumph. In winter, when the fog rolls across the Kiel fjord, as it does every year, the harbour becomes almost dreamlike. The sound of water against modern hulls is softer than it was when steel was constantly being shaped and tested. The docks are quieter. The air smells of salt and industry, but the industry is gentler now. The urgency is gone, replaced by the steady, purposeful rhythm of a port city doing what port cities do, connecting people, moving goods, maintaining the infrastructure that keeps the sea and the land in conversation with each other. If you were to ask the residents of Kiel or Wilhelmshaven what they think of when they think of their towns, most would probably not begin with war. They would speak of the university in Kiel, founded in the 18th century and still thriving. They would mention the festivals that draw crowds to the waterfront in summer. They would remember family connections to the shipyards, not as places of weapons manufacture, but as places where skilled workers took pride in their craft. The history is there, embedded in the streets and the buildings and the names of monuments, but it shares space with everything that has come after. There are, nonetheless, moments when the weight of that history becomes tangible. The war graves, carefully maintained by caretakers who never fought in the wars they remember, stand in quiet rows on the outskirts of both towns. The memorials to the sailors who did not return from patrol or who went down with their boats are visited by families who lost relatives in those waters, and by tourists who have come to try to understand what happened in a time they did not live through. These places are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be understood and, having been understood, to be carried forward as lessons rather than repetitions. The modern German Navy still maintains a presence in Kiel, though it is entirely different in character from what preceded it. The men and women who serve there are professionals dedicated to maritime security and international cooperation. They work under rules of engagement and international law that reflect a different world order, one built partly on the lessons that were learned in these harbours and across the entire continent. The uniforms have changed, the mission has changed, the weight of history touches them, but it does not define them. As night falls over the fjord, the lights of the modern city begin to shimmer on the water. These are not the lights of wartime blackout, when every lamp was extinguished and the harbour existed in darkness. These are the lights of a functioning, peacetime city. They reflect off the water with a gentleness that speaks to the passage of time and the possibility of healing. The ships at anchor sway slowly with the tide, indifferent to their own origins or purposes. They simply exist, as ships have done for thousands of years, in spaces where humans have learned to work with water rather than against it. What remains, then, is not a single story, but an enormous collection of stories. The story of the engineer who designed revolutionary hull forms and whose name is now forgotten. The story of the worker who built thousands of rivets and whose hands remembered the work long after his body could no longer do it. The story of the families who waited for boats that never returned. The story of the towns themselves, which endured bombardment and occupation and the complete transformation of their economic and social structures, and which emerged changed but continuous. The fog continues to roll in from the North Sea, as it has always done, softening the edges of the harbour and the buildings and the memory of everything that happened here. It is neither a judgment nor a forgiveness. It is simply the weather, the same weather that fell on medieval traders and modern tourists alike. It is part of the rhythm of these places, part of what makes them what they are. If you listen carefully to the harbour at night, you can hear many things in the sound of the water against the hulls and the gentle creak of mooring lines. You can hear the echo of riveters' hammers and the voices of workers calling to each other across the slipways. You can hear the diesel engines of departing submarines and the silence of the ocean floor where they came to rest. You can hear the sirens that warned of bombs and the quiet gratitude of those who survived. But beneath all of these sounds, underlying and steadying them all, is the simple, eternal sound of water moving, of tides rising and falling, of the harbour continuing to be a harbour, a place where land and sea negotiate their endless, patient conversation. The towns are asleep now, most of their residents tucked into homes that were built on ground where earlier homes once stood, where earlier people once lived and worked and dreamed their own dreams. The shipyards are quiet, waiting for morning and the resumption of ordinary work. The museums are closed, their preserved vessels resting in their final berths. And the fjord, that same fjord that witnessed the rise and fall of empires and the transformation of entire worlds, continues its ancient rhythm,